Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles in like a gentle tide, and science drifts softly into your evening. Tonight, we're not glancing at the stars or the ticking of clocks. Instead, we're lowering ourselves into waters that once covered much of the planet. Waters that held creatures unlike anything you might see in a modern aquarium, and yet they were the very ancestors of so much life that would come after. This story takes us more than 400 million years back, into an age known as the Devonian, sometimes called the Age of Fishes, a time when fins and scales weren't just drifting in the seas, but shaping the very course of evolution. Before we swim too far, let me ask, where in the world are you listening from right now? And if you glanced at a clock, what moment of your own day or night are you in? It's curious, isn't it, that we can talk about times so vast, whole eras lasting tens of millions of years, while you and I are sitting here in a single slice of our own small timeline. Somewhere, in your quiet room, while waves of history far deeper than any ocean move silently beneath us. If you find these wanderings soothing, or you enjoy slipping into a story of Earth's past while you unwind, it would mean the world if you tapped like or maybe subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm ripple out to others who might also need a soft landing before sleep. So let's sink beneath the surface together. Picture the Earth in the Devonian Period, about 419 to 359 million years ago. The continents were not arranged as we know them today. Much of what would become North America was clustered with parts of Europe near the equator, forming warm, shallow seas. To the south stretched a vast supercontinent called Gondwana, covering regions that are now South America, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia. The climate was largely warm, seas high, and the land itself still barren in many places, only beginning to be greened by early plants. The Earth at this moment was in transition, poised between ancient worlds of simple marine life and the first great experiments of creatures that would step beyond water. If we were standing on a rocky coastline then, the air would feel different. Oxygen levels were beginning to rise, thanks to plants that had started spreading across land. But the sky would be unfamiliar, without birds, without buzzing insects, without the hum of mammals or the rustle of reptiles. Silence above, yet below the surface, life was booming in extraordinary forms. Fish of many designs, some armoured like walking fortresses, others sleek and fast, swarmed the seas. Coral reefs stretched like undersea metropolises, bustling with activity, and predators began to grow larger, stranger, and hungrier than ever before. It's hard to picture just how revolutionary this age was. Before the Devonian, fish existed, but they were relatively simple and limited. What happened during these 60 million years was nothing less than an evolutionary explosion. Fish diversified into new shapes, new sizes, new strategies. Some developed crushing jaws capable of snapping through armour. Others found ways to breathe not just in water, but in air, setting the stage for vertebrates to eventually crawl onto land. In truth, every time you take a breath or stretch your arms, you're using innovations that were first tested in Devonian seas. The Devonian wasn't just about fish, of course. Plants had begun their conquest of the land. Mosses and small green shoots had already appeared in earlier times, but now something remarkable was happening. The first trees were rising, rooting deep into soil, drawing water upward and reaching toward the sun. Forests began to appear, and with them the land changed forever. Roots broke apart rocks, creating new soil, and plants altered the atmosphere, stabilizing carbon dioxide, feeding oxygen into the air, and shaping climates. Imagine walking on land in those days. No birdsong, no grass underfoot because grasses didn't exist yet. Instead, you'd see strange, spindly plants, early ferns and towering leafless trees like great green poles. Insects had not yet taken to the skies, but arthropods like millipedes and scorpions were beginning to scuttle across the ground, exploring these new green territories. But it was in the water that the drama truly unfolded. Take the placoderms, for example. These were armoured fish, covered in bony plates that gave them a tank-like appearance. Some were small, but others grew to lengths of 6 meters or more. The most famous, Dunkleosteus, had jaws powerful enough to slice through almost anything, even the armour of other placoderms. Instead of teeth, they had sharp bony plates that acted like shears. To swim in a Devonian sea was to risk crossing paths with these monsters, and if you did, your story probably ended quickly. At the same time, sharks were beginning to emerge. Not the exact sharks we know today, but their ancestors, already learning the art of streamlined movement, already relying on cartilage instead of heavy bone. While placoderms lumbered with armour, early sharks darted with speed. It was a contest of strategies, armour versus agility, brute force versus swift precision. Both approaches worked, at least for a time. Meanwhile, reefs flourished. Unlike modern reefs built mainly by corals of the stony type we know, Devonian reefs were assembled by a mix of corals and sponges, growing into vast structures. These reefs created habitats that sheltered smaller fish, mollusks, and all manner of marine invertebrates. They were biodiversity hotspots, much like modern coral reefs, humming with life and competition. But they were also fragile, vulnerable to shifts in climate and sea chemistry, and in time they would face collapse. Perhaps the most remarkable story in this period was told by lobe-finned fish, unlike the ray-finned fish, whose fins spread out in delicate rays like those of a goldfish or trout. Lobe-finned fish had sturdy, fleshy fins supported by bones. These fins weren't just for swimming. They could push against the seabed, prop up the body, and in time, evolve into limbs. From these lobe-finned pioneers came creatures like Tiktaalik, with both fish-like and amphibian traits. Flat-headed, with eyes on top of its skull, and fins strong enough to support weight, Tiktaalik is often called the Reshaping, a bridge between water and land. When you flex your wrist or take a step, you're echoing the movement of these long-lost ancestors. The Devonian was also marked by change and upheaval. Seas rose and fell, climates shifted, and toward the end of the period, life faced a devastating series of extinctions. Reefs collapsed, many armoured fish vanished, and ecosystems were reshaped. Yet even in loss, there was transformation. Survivors carried forward innovations that would shape the next chapters of evolution. Amphibians emerged from lobe-finned fish, and from them would eventually come reptiles, mammals, and humans. It's strange to think that so much of what defines us began in that watery world. Lungs adapted from air bladders, limbs from fins, even the structure of our skeletons owe their roots to Devonian experiments. If you could stand on a Devonian shoreline and peer into the shallows, you might not recognise yourself in the creatures moving there. But if you looked closely, you'd see a shadow of your own future in the flex of a fin, the gulp of air, the lift of a head above the water. And so, as we drift further into this story, keep in mind that this isn't just the tale of strange armoured fish or forests without birdsong. It's the tale of how Earth rehearsed for land animals, how seas became laboratories of innovation, and how fish, small, large, armoured, sleek, took over the Earth and in many ways gave rise to us. Before the Devonian could become the age of fishes, there was another stage set just before it, a quieter but no less important rehearsal in the Silurian period. To understand how fish came to dominate Earth's waters, we have to picture what the oceans looked like when they were only beginning to welcome them. Around 443 million years ago, as the Silurian began, Earth had just endured one of its great crises. A mass extinction at the end of the Ordovician had swept away much of marine life. Entire communities of trilobites, brachiopods and graptolites had dwindled. Ice ages had locked water into glaciers, dropping sea levels, and when those glaciers melted, flooding returned. The world was unsettled, but life proved once again that it could rebuild. Out of that disruption came a period of stability, a greenhouse climate, seas warming again, and ecosystems reshaping themselves into new patterns. If you could dive into a Silurian sea, the first thing you'd notice is how much quieter it was than the bustling Devonian waters that would follow. There were no 6-metre armoured predators yet, no dense forests of kelp swaying overhead. Instead, the seas were ruled by invertebrates. Coral reefs were beginning to appear, though smaller than the grand Devonian reefs to come. Stromatoporoids, sponge-like organisms, were among the key builders, laying down carbonate skeletons that made little platforms for others to live on. Coral polyps nestled alongside them, forming patchy reefs that gave refuge to small creatures. If you picture the reef fish darting about today's coral ecosystems, you'd be wrong. There were none of those yet. Instead, the inhabitants were sea scorpions, mollusks, crinoids, and brachiopods filtering food from the water. Trilobites still crawled across the seafloor. They had survived the extinction, though diminished, and in the Silurian they were no longer the dominant force they had been earlier. Instead, they were just one part of a larger cast. These armoured, many-eyed arthropods scuttled over sediments, some small enough to fit on your fingertip, others the size of a dinner plate. They sifted detritus, burrowed into mud, or hunted tiny prey. Alongside them lived brachiopods, creatures that resembled clams but belonged to an entirely different lineage. Their shells hinged top to bottom rather than side to side. Rows of them studded the sea floor, opening their valves to filter plankton from the passing currents. Floating in the water column, graptolites, which had once flourished, now dwindled into their twilight. These colonial animals, housed in saw blade-like structures, had dominated Ordovician seas, but by the Silurian their numbers were shrinking. Instead, new players were arriving. Among the most remarkable were the Eurypterids, the sea scorpions. Some of these Silurian predators reached lengths of 2 meters, with clawed appendages and paddles that let them sweep through shallow waters. Imagine walking along a Silurian shoreline and seeing one of these massive arthropods thrash in the surf. Some would eventually leave the water to creep onto land, among the earliest explorers of shores, long before vertebrates tried the same. But perhaps the most important story of the Silurian seas was what was happening with fish. Before this period, fish existed in very primitive forms. Jawless fish, called agnathons, were among the earliest vertebrates. They had no jaws, no paired fins, just eel-like bodies and round, sucking mouths. They filtered or scraped food, not very fearsome but persistent. In the Silurian, these jawless fish diversified. Some grew heavy bony armour at the front of their bodies, like the osteostracans, giving them protection against predators. Their heads were shielded, their tails flexible, and for the first time paired fins began to appear. That was a quiet revolution. With paired fins, fish could stabilise themselves in the water, control their movement, and explore niches in ways their eel-like ancestors could not. Alongside them, something even more extraordinary was taking place. The first jawed vertebrates appeared. Known as gnathostomes, these pioneers carried one of the most important evolutionary inventions of all time: jaws. Until then, most vertebrates were limited to filter feeding or scraping. Jaws opened the door to active predation, to biting, holding and chewing. In the Silurian seas, these early jawed fish were still modest, not the titans they would become later, but their presence was a signal of what was coming. Small placoderms, armoured but agile, darted between corals. Early cartilaginous fish, ancestors of sharks and rays, began to refine streamlined movement. They were shadows of what the Devonian would showcase, but the foundations were already being laid. Above the waterline the world was changing too. Land was still mostly bare, rocky and barren, but the Silurian was when the first real wave of plants began to spread. Simple vascular plants like Cooksonia sprouted only a few centimetres tall, but their innovation was profound. Vascular tissue allowed them to move water and nutrients through stems, letting them grow taller than the mosses and liverworts that had come before. These little green pioneers crept across riverbanks and wetlands, stabilising soil, and beginning the long, slow, transformation of land into habitable space. With plants came the first true soils, and with them, arthropods had reason to venture onto land. Fossils show millipede-like creatures, scorpions and centipedes beginning to scuttle in these new environments. They were small, but they represented a momentous step. For the first time, life was carving out niches beyond the sea. It's fascinating to think of the Silurian as a bridge. On one side, the Ordovician world of trilobite-dominated seas and unfamiliar reefs. On the other, the Devonian explosion of fish diversity, forests and vertebrate pioneers stepping onto land. The Silurian carried the first sparks of what was to come. Paired fins, jaws, vascular plants, land arthropods, all appeared here, like rehearsals before the grand performance of the Devonian. If you looked at the ocean from a Silurian shore, the water might shimmer green with algae. Waves would wash over rocks dotted with the first creeping plants. In the shallows, eurypterids might stir up silt. Small jawless fish would dart in schools, glinting in the light, while a few jawed fish tested their new ability to snap at prey. The reefs would hum with brachiopods opening and closing, crinoids waving their feathery arms, and corals building tiny fortresses. It would seem calm, almost modest. Yet hidden in those waters were revolutions that would change Earth forever. The invention of jaws may seem simple, but think about the impact. With jaws, fish could become predators, not just scavengers. They could seize food, process it efficiently, and grow larger. With jaws came teeth, or at least the bony precursors of them. This was the start of predation as we know it, a shift that rippled through ecosystems. Prey evolved defenses, armor, speed, hiding strategies. Predators evolved sharper jaws, better fins, stronger senses. An evolutionary arms race had begun, and its consequences would echo through all future ecosystems, right up to the lions, sharks, and eagles of today. And then there were those tiny plants on land. They seem insignificant. Little stalks no taller than your ankle. But they were rewriting Earth's atmosphere. By drawing carbon dioxide from the air and releasing oxygen, they began to alter the composition of the air above them. More oxygen meant more potential for animals to eventually breathe it. Roots broke rock apart, creating soil, and as soils formed, rivers and coastlines changed. With plants came stability, landscapes no longer shifting mudflats but slowly turning into green territories. The Silurian also set the stage for forests. Though there were no true trees yet, the vascular plants of this period paved the way for them. By the Devonian, forests would rise, but it was in the Silurian that the groundwork was laid, quietly, almost invisibly. That's how many revolutions in Earth's history begin. Not with an explosion, but with a whisper. A small fish with paired fins. A little plant with vascular tissue. A scorpion creeping on damp soil. Each small step would, in time, tip the balance of life in entirely new directions. Looking back, it's tempting to see the Silurian as a prologue, but it was a world in its own right. Its seas sparkled with strange beauty, its reefs supported communities, and its creatures pushed into uncharted territory. For the first time, vertebrates were experimenting with true predation. For the first time, plants were reaching upward, grasping at the sun. For the first time, animals were leaving the water behind, however briefly, to test the air. And when the Devonian dawned, those experiments would blossom. Fish would surge into dominance. Forests would take hold. Ecosystems would sprawl across land and sea. But without the Silurian, without its careful groundwork, the age of fishes might never have happened at all. By the time the Devonian dawned, the oceans of Earth were already full of quiet experiments. For hundreds of millions of years, life had tried out different body plans, different strategies for survival, some elegant, some clumsy, many ending in failure. Yet among all those early experiments, a new kind of creature was rising. They were small at first, not the towering predators of later ages, but their invention was so powerful that it changed the course of vertebrate history. These were the first fish with true fins, and through them, the story of all vertebrates began to unfold. To appreciate how radical fins were, imagine the difference between drifting and steering. Earlier vertebrates, the jawless fish of the Ordovician and Silurian seas, could wriggle their bodies in waves, propel themselves forward, and maybe angle slightly to one side. They were more like eels, moving with the whole length of their bodies. But fine control, quick turns, stability in the currents, that was beyond them. Fins changed everything. They gave balance, lift, and control. Suddenly a fish could hold steady in the water, move with precision, dart to grab food, or escape from predators. It was like moving from rolling down a hill in a barrel to steering a canoe. The earliest fins weren't exactly the elegant structures we picture on a modern fish. They were simple flaps of flesh supported by rods of cartilage or bone. But even the most basic paired fins, the pectoral and pelvic fins, transformed swimming. With them, fish could pitch their bodies up or down, roll less awkwardly, and maneuver in ways impossible for their finless ancestors. Evolution had stumbled onto something that worked, and once it worked, it stuck. Every vertebrate alive today, from trout to tigers to humans, carries the legacy of paired fins. Our arms and legs trace their ancestry back to those first aquatic paddles. In the Devonian, the seas filled with both jawless fish and their new rivals, the jawed fish who had begun to claim dominance. The jawless ones, like the ostracoderms, still carried heavy armour plates around their heads and chests, protection against predators. Their fins were developing, but they remained small, often limited to pectoral fins that gave them some balance. They were slow but well shielded, drifting along sea floors, scraping algae, or filter feeding from sediments. Imagine them like living shields, their bodies front-loaded with thick bone, tails trailing behind. But next to them, sleeker forms began to appear. These were the gnathostoms, the jawed fish, and within them were two great lineages that would shape the Devonian seas, the placoderms and the cartilaginous fish. Placoderms, armoured yet agile, took the defensive strategies of the ostracoderms and refined them with jaws and stronger fins. They grew larger, some reaching terrifying sizes. Dunkleosteus, which would later rule the Devonian oceans, was the pinnacle of this design. A fish with bone-crushing jaws and the bulk of a small bus. But even in smaller forms, placoderms showed what fins could do. They manoeuvred through reefs, hunted prey, and competed with one another in ways their jawless cousins could never match. Cartilaginous fish, ancestors of modern sharks and rays, explored another path. Their skeletons were lighter, made of cartilage rather than heavy bone. This gave them speed. Combined with paired fins, it meant they could slice through water in sudden bursts, darting and turning more quickly than the armoured placoderms. These were still early sharks, far from the great whites we imagine today, but their strategy was clear: streamline, lighten, sharpen. Predation became more than a blunt act of armour crashing into armour. It became a chase, a game of speed and precision. Ray-finned fish were also taking shape in the Devonian. These were the actinopterygians, whose fins spread out in delicate rays rather than fleshy lobes. Their bodies were lighter, more flexible, and capable of fine-tuned swimming. They weren't yet the dominant group they would become in later ages, but they were already testing out strategies that would carry them into immense success. Today, ray-finned fish make up the vast majority of fish species. Goldfish, salmon, clownfish, eels, tuna, all are descendants of these Devonian pioneers. Back then, though, they were still small, one branch among many in a diverse aquatic world. And then there were the lobe-finned fish, the sarcopterygians. Their fins were thick, fleshy, with a central bone structure that foreshadowed limbs. Unlike the delicate rays of their actinopterygian cousins, these fins could push against the sea floor. They could support weight. They were clumsy oars compared to our legs, but they hinted at the possibility of life beyond water. Lobe fins gave rise to lungfish and coelacanths, some of which survive even today. Most importantly, they were the direct ancestors of tetrapods, the first four-limbed vertebrates to walk on land. Without those sturdy lobes, there would be no frogs, no lizards, no mammals, no humans. The first steps on land began in the flick of a Devonian lobe-finned tail. When we picture these early finned fish, it's easy to see them as primitive or half-finished, but in their own time they were marvels of design. A fish with paired fins could hug the contours of a reef, swoop upward to snap at prey, or steady itself while scanning for danger. For predators, fins meant control in pursuit. For prey, fins meant escape routes. Suddenly, the dynamics of marine ecosystems shifted. It wasn't just a matter of who was armoured, but who could move with precision. Fins opened a new evolutionary arms race that would last forever. The Devonian seas were crowded with these experiments. Imagine swimming through a reef lagoon 390 million years ago. Sunlight would dapple through shallow water, illuminating corals and sponges. Schools of small ray-finned fish might shimmer like silver clouds, each flick of their delicate fins moving them as one. In the shadows, a placoderm might glide by, its heavy plates reflecting faint glimmers, its paired fins propelling its bulk with surprising agility. Above the reef, a lobe-finned fish might rest near the bottom, its strong fins pushing gently against rocks as it lurked for prey. Every movement told the same story. Fins were rewriting survival. It's worth pausing to reflect on how subtle innovations can reshape entire worlds. A jaw changes how you eat. A fin changes how you move. Neither seems revolutionary at first, yet both together remade Earth's oceans. Fins allowed fish to conquer habitats they never could before. Shallow streams, murky lagoons, rocky reefs, all opened up as possibilities. Paired fins stabilized bodies in currents, letting fish colonize rivers that would have tumbled jawless, finless ancestors about helplessly. They could now climb gradients of water, explore coastlines, push into freshwater lakes. With jaws and fins, fish weren't just surviving. They were expanding, testing limits, carving out new ways of life. In these ancient seas, there was no single blueprint for success. Placoderms wore their armour proudly, sharks bet on speed, ray fins refined agility, lobe fins explored strength. Each group tried a different balance between protection, mobility and feeding strategies. Some paths would end in extinction, like the placoderms who thrived for a time but left no descendants. Others would endure, like the sharks who continue to roam oceans today. And some would lead to entirely new worlds, like the lobe fins whose descendants would step onto land and eventually learn to walk, run, and fly. The rise of fins also tells us something about the nature of evolution. It doesn't move with a plan or purpose. It doesn't aim for a particular outcome. Instead, it tinkers. A slight extension of cartilage becomes a fin. A stronger fin bone lets a fish push off the bottom. A lung-like structure helps it gulp air in oxygen-poor water. Each small tweak accumulates, and over millions of years, the world looks utterly different. What seems inevitable in hindsight, the rise of fish, the conquest of land, was in reality a fragile chain of accidents, each link shaped by survival in its own moment. And yet, sitting here now, we can trace it back. We can look at our own arms and legs, at the fine bones of our wrists and ankles, and know that they are modified fins. The hands typing on a keyboard, the feet walking across a floor, the lungs filling with air, all are echoes of Devonian fish. We are not just descended from them in a distant genealogical sense, we carry their bodies in ours. The Devonian was not just the age of fishes, it was the beginning of us. As we move deeper into this age, the seas grow more complex, predators more fearsome, prey more elusive. Reefs expand, forests begin to rise, and life pushes further onto land. But it all circles back to those first fins, flicking in the current, steering through ancient seas, rewriting what it meant to be alive in water. If the Devonian oceans could be compared to a battlefield, then the placoderms were the armoured cavalry. They weren't sleek like early sharks, and they weren't delicate like the first ray-finned fish. They were walking fortresses of bone, heavy at the front, flexible at the back, and for a time they dominated almost every corner of the seas. To understand just how impressive these creatures were, it helps to picture what armour meant in a Devonian world. The seas of this period were crowded, not just with small invertebrates and drifting plankton, but with predators. Being defenceless was no longer an option. In earlier ages, simple jawless fish had managed by scraping algae or filter feeding, their bodies soft except for a few patches of protective plates. But once jaws arrived, the rules changed. Suddenly there were hunters capable of seizing, biting and crushing. For prey, that meant you either learned to run faster or you learned to withstand the assault. Placoderms chose the second path. Their heads and thoraxes were wrapped in solid, bony shields, plates fitted together like a natural suit of armour. Behind that armoured front, their bodies tapered into more flexible tails that allowed them to move with surprising efficiency, despite the heavy plating. One of the most extraordinary things about placoderm armour is how varied it was. Some species carried broad head shields, others had overlapping plates forming almost a helmet. In some, the armour extended into jagged ridges that likely discouraged predators from biting. The plates themselves were not just simple slabs. They were living bone, sometimes ornamented with ridges or tubercles, giving each species its own distinctive pattern. To a Devonian eye, these armoured fish would not have looked uniform. They were decorated with nature's own engravings, shining in the light that filtered through shallow seas. But armour alone doesn't win battles. Placoderms also carried one of the most important evolutionary weapons, jaws. Unlike modern fish with rows of teeth, many placoderms had sharp, bony plates lining their jaws. These acted like shears, capable of slicing through flesh and even cracking into the armour of other fish. Dunkleosteus, the most famous of them all, could open its jaws at lightning speed and deliver a bite force among the strongest ever measured in any animal. Some estimates suggest it could bite with a force of over 6,000 newtons, enough to puncture metal if it had ever met any. Imagine a predator 6 meters long, armoured at the front with jaws like bone-cutting scissors. In Devonian seas there was no rival more feared. Still, not every placoderm was a giant killer. The group was remarkably diverse. Some were small, no bigger than your hand, nibbling at plants or scraping algae from rocks. Others were mid-sized, feeding on invertebrates or small fish. They lived in rivers as well as oceans, in shallow lagoons as well as deeper waters. Some specialised in crushing hard-shelled prey, their jaws adapted into grinding surfaces rather than cutting blades. It's easy to imagine placoderm reefs buzzing with activity, small armoured grazers picking at coral, mid-sized predators lurking in shadows, and at the top colossal Dunkleosteus patrolling like a submarine. For about 50 million years, placoderms flourished. Their success wasn't just in brute force, they were also innovators. Fossil evidence suggests that placoderms may have been among the first vertebrates to practice internal fertilization. In some species, males had bony claspers to transfer sperm directly to females. That may not sound remarkable now, but in evolutionary history it was groundbreaking. It meant that at least some placoderms gave birth to live young, offering them a head start in survival compared to eggs left exposed in the water. The armoured fish were not only dominating the seas but also experimenting with reproductive strategies that would later be carried on by sharks, mammals and eventually ourselves. Placoderms also remind us how evolution balances costs and benefits. Armour made them formidable, but it also made them heavy. They could not match the speed of sharks. Their thick plates required energy to grow and limited their flexibility. For millions of years, these drawbacks didn't matter much. They were kings of the ocean regardless. But as ecosystems changed, their armour became less of an advantage. When the late Devonian extinction struck, reefs collapsed, food webs shifted and placoderms declined. Their diversity shrank and eventually they vanished entirely. Unlike sharks, they left no descendants, Their reign was glorious, but it was finite. Still, their legacy is everywhere. Placoderms proved that armour and jaws could turn a vertebrate into a top predator. They pushed prey species to evolve faster swimming, better hiding, and more complex strategies of escape. They forced ecosystems to diversify, setting off ripple effects that reshaped life. And in their experiments with reproduction, they hinted at the possibilities of parental investment and live birth. Even though no placoderm survives today, their story shaped the path of vertebrate evolution. Imagine standing at the edge of a Devonian reef and looking down. In the clear water, you might see schools of small ray-finned fish glittering like silver coins. Among them, small placoderms would shuffle and dart, their armoured heads glinting faintly. Deeper, a shadow would move, too large to be anything but Dunkleosteus. With one sweep of its tail, it could cross the reef, jaws opening with terrifying speed. Nearby, a lobe-finned fish might push itself against the sandy bottom, trying to stay unnoticed. The entire drama of predator and prey was unfolding beneath you, driven in large part by the armour and jaws of the placoderms. There's a certain irony in how complete their extinction was. These were once the rulers of the seas, the undisputed apex predators of their time, yet when they disappeared, their niche didn't vanish with them. Sharks rose to fill the gap, refining speed and stealth instead of armour. Ray-finned fish expanded into countless new forms, taking over the roles placoderms had once played. Evolution rarely leaves a vacancy unfilled. The fall of the armoured giants paved the way for others to flourish. It's tempting to imagine what might have happened if placoderms had survived. Would our oceans today be patrolled by massive armoured fish, their descendants still clad in bony plates? Would sharks have remained in the shadows, never reaching the dominance they enjoy now? We can't know, of course, but it reminds us how precarious success can be. The mightiest animals of one era can be gone in the next, their glory recorded only in stone. When you hold a fossil placoderm plate in your hand today, it feels oddly familiar. The bone has textures that echo patterns in our own skeletons. These were, after all, vertebrates like us. Their story is not separate from ours. It is part of it. We may not wear armour on our heads, but our jaws, our skeletons, even aspects of our reproduction carry echoes of what placoderms once pioneered. To study them is not just to marvel at their strangeness, but to recognise pieces of ourselves in their design. The Devonian seas would not remain theirs forever. Change was coming, as it always does. Sharks were waiting in the shadows, refining their speed. Lobe fins were practising with their sturdy fins, preparing for the first tentative steps onto land. Forests were rising on shore, altering the chemistry of air and water, shifting the balance of ecosystems. The armoured giants would fall, but their era was unforgettable. They remind us that evolution rewards many strategies: armour, speed, strength, cunning. But none is permanent. Success belongs only to the present moment, never guaranteed for the future. For a time, though, placoderms ruled as kings and queens of the water. They were the heavy cavalry of evolution, clad in bone, armed with jaws, pushing the boundaries of what vertebrates could become. And when we drift further into their world, we see how their presence shaped not just their own time, but everything that followed. Because once you add armour and jaws to the story of life, nothing can ever be the same again. While placoderms armoured themselves in bone and muscle, another lineage was quietly refining a very different strategy. They weren't heavy, and they weren't clad in thick shields. Their skeletons were light, made not of bone, but of cartilage. Their bodies were shaped for speed, their senses tuned for hunting, and in time, they would outlast almost every other predator in Earth's history. These were the sharks, the cartilage kings of the deep, and their story begins here in the Devonian seas. To imagine what made sharks different, think of two tools lying side by side. One is a massive hammer, solid, powerful, able to smash almost anything in its path. The other is a scalpel, sharp, light, designed for precision. Placoderms were the hammers of the Devonian oceans, while sharks were the scalpels. Both strategies worked, but one came with the advantage of adaptability. A lighter body meant less energy was required to move. Flexible cartilage meant skeletons could bend, twist, and absorb impacts. Combined with fins that allowed precise control, sharks became the fast, efficient hunters that would rise to dominance long after the armoured placoderms were gone. The earliest sharks didn't look exactly like the ones we know today. If you picture a great white or a hammerhead, you're leaping far ahead in time. Devonian sharks were smaller, often no more than a metre or two in length. They lacked the highly refined body shapes of their modern descendants, but they carried the essentials: cartilage skeletons, multiple rows of sharp teeth, paired fins that gave them control in the water, and gills that allowed them to thrive in varied conditions. One of the earliest known was Cladocelach, a sleek predator with a streamlined body and a mouthful of teeth suited for slicing fish. It didn't have the size of Dunkleosteus, but it had speed on its side, and speed often meant survival. Sharks brought something else to the seas that was just as revolutionary as armour or jaws. They introduced the concept of the replaceable tooth. Unlike placoderms, whose biting plates were permanent, sharks grew teeth in rows. When one tooth broke or wore down, another slid forward to take its place. This conveyor belt of teeth meant sharks were always armed with fresh, sharp weapons. It was an adaptation so successful that sharks still use it today. Modern sharks may shed thousands of teeth in a lifetime, each one a disposable blade, ensuring they never face the sea unarmed. Imagine what that meant in Devonian waters. Predators that could always bite at full strength, never dulled by wear, never limited by the fragility of their weapons. Cartilage gave them another hidden advantage. While bone is strong, it is also heavy. Cartilage is lighter, and in water, that lightness translates into speed. A shark's body doesn't need to waste as much energy fighting gravity. Instead, it glides, powered by strong muscles and controlled by finely tuned fins. Even in the Devonian, sharks were already experimenting with forms that balance speed and stability. Some had elongated bodies built for chasing prey in open water, others had flatter shapes, suited for hugging the seafloor and ambushing unsuspecting fish. This diversity hinted at the adaptability that would later make sharks nearly unstoppable. But hunting is not only about body design, it's also about senses. Fossil evidence suggests that even early sharks had highly developed sensory systems. Their nostrils could detect faint traces of chemicals in the water. Their lateral lines, a series of pressure-sensitive organs along the sides of their bodies, allowed them to feel vibrations, sensing the movements of nearby animals. Later sharks would develop electroreception, the ability to detect the weak electric fields produced by living creatures, but even in these early stages their sensory suite gave them an edge. Placoderms relied on sight and brute force, but sharks could hunt in murkier waters, stalk prey at night, and detect movements invisible to less sensitive predators. For tens of millions of years, sharks lived alongside placoderms, occupying different roles. Placoderms ruled the shallows and the reefs, while sharks darted through open waters and rivers. Each had its place, but the balance was fragile. When the late Devonian extinction struck, reefs collapsed, ecosystems faltered, and placoderms began their slow decline. Sharks, with their lighter bodies, rapid reproduction, and adaptable hunting strategies, weathered the storm. When the armoured giants vanished, sharks remained, stepping into the role of oceanic predators for the next 400 million years. They are still here today, while the placoderms survive only as fossils. It's easy to overlook how radical cartilage was as a choice. In human terms, bone seems better. It's stronger, harder, longer lasting. But in the ever-shifting seas of the Devonian, being light and flexible was just as powerful as being armoured. Sharks chose speed over shields, and in the long run, speed won. It reminds us that evolution doesn't crown the strongest or the toughest, but the most adaptable. Those who can change with their environments, who can shift strategies as the world shifts around them, are the ones who last. Sharks are living proof. If you could dive into a Devonian bay, you might see the contrast firsthand. A placoderm might lumber past, its armour glinting like a medieval knight beneath the waves. A few metres away, a shark would slip silently through the water, its body curving with each beat of its tail. The placoderm could crush anything caught in its jaws, but the shark could simply glide out of reach, circle back, and strike from the shadows. Two predators, two philosophies of survival. One would dominate for a moment, the other for eternity. Even the scale of their reproduction played a role. Placoderms may have given live birth in some species, but they were slower to reproduce than sharks. Sharks produced more offspring and grew faster, ensuring that even if some failed, others survived. When environmental crises hit, that mattered. Species with slower reproduction are often hit hardest in extinctions. Those with quicker turnover, more flexible survival strategies stand a better chance of bouncing back. For sharks, the Devonian extinction wasn't an end, it was an opportunity. And once placoderms were gone, sharks began their long, uninterrupted watch over the oceans. They survived multiple mass extinctions, from the Devonian to the Permian, from the Triassic to the Cretaceous. They swam alongside dinosaurs, saw the rise of mammals, and continue to glide through seas today. When you look into the eyes of a modern shark, you're staring into a lineage that stretches unbroken back to those first Devonian hunters. Their cartilage skeletons, their endless teeth, their finely tuned senses, all of it began in those warm seas more than 400 million years ago. The Devonian may be called the Age of Fishes, but in truth, it was also the dawn of the sharks. They weren't the largest predators of the time. That title belonged to Dunkleosteus, but they were the survivors. The quiet kings waiting in the background, honing their craft until the moment came to take the crown. Today they are often feared, sometimes misunderstood, but their persistence is undeniable. They are the living shadows of an age when armoured giants fell and cartilage conquerors rose. And as we move further into this story, the seas only grow more complex. Coral reefs expand into vast cities under the waves, filled with colour and movement. Fish diversify into hundreds of new forms, some stranger than fiction. And above the waves, plants continue their march onto land, reshaping the very chemistry of the air. The Devonian is swelling with life in every direction, and the sharks, now firmly established, are there to witness it all. When you picture a reef today, you might think of tropical waters filled with bright corals, darting fish, sea turtles gliding between ridges, and countless creatures tucked into the crevices. They're some of the most vivid ecosystems on Earth, packed with diversity. But the story of reefs is far older than modern corals. Long before the Great Barrier Reef or Caribbean atolls, before parrotfish and clownfish made their homes among stony corals, there were the reefs of the Devonian. And for millions of years they were the greatest construction projects nature had ever attempted. These reefs were not small features. They stretched for hundreds of kilometres in some areas, towering structures built by armies of tiny builders. Imagine standing on the edge of a Devonian shoreline and looking out across shallow seas. Beneath the surface, enormous reef complexes rose like underwater mountain chains. They weren't built by the same corals we know today, but by an older caste of reef builders, stromatoporoids and tabulate corals, often working together to create vast habitats. Stromatoporoids were sponge-like organisms with hard skeletons. They built up layers of calcium carbonate, one atop another like sheets of stone. Slowly, steadily, their colonies grew into mounds and ridges. Beside them, tabulate corals added their own structures, forming honeycomb-like colonies of tiny tubes. The two together became the architects of an empire, creating the framework for entire ecosystems. Crinoids, brachiopods, mollusks, and fish flocked to these habitats. Every crevice was filled, every ridge a hunting ground or a shelter. if you could dive into one of these Devonian reefs, you would find them alive with a movement. Small ray-finned fish would flit between coral heads, their fins catching the light. Lobe-finned fish might lurk in shaded crevices, watching for prey. Eurypterids, the giant sea scorpions, could be seen prowling at the edges. Placoderms patrolled like armoured guards, while early sharks sliced silently through open water nearby. All of them were drawn to the reefs, because reefs were where life concentrated. Food, shelter and breeding grounds all converged in these underwater cities. Reefs are more than just structures, they're engines of biodiversity. They provide hiding places for the weak, ambush spots for hunters, surfaces for plants and algae, and foundations for endless symbioses. In the Devonian, this principle was already at work. Animals and plants that couldn't survive in the open sea thrived in the protection of reefs. Some species lived only in those environments, becoming specialists in reef life. Others passed through, using reefs as nurseries for their young before moving on. The reefs tied entire ecosystems together, much as they do today. But reefs also tell a story about the power of small creatures to reshape the earth. Stromatoporoids and corals were tiny compared to placoderms or sharks, yet their collective efforts built monuments that lasted millions of years. Their skeletons layered into limestone, forming deposits that can still be seen in rock outcrops today. In parts of modern Canada, Australia and Europe, you can walk across ancient Devonian reef structures, now turned to stone, fossils of entire ecosystems petrified in place. The chemistry of the oceans played a role in their construction. Warm, shallow seas rich in calcium carbonate provided the raw materials for reef growth. Sunlight penetrated the clear waters, feeding algae that lived in symbiosis with corals, just as they do today. The Devonian climate, largely warm and stable, gave reefs the conditions to spread across much of the planet. In fact, some scientists believe the Devonian reefs were the largest that have ever existed in Earth's history, far larger than anything we see in modern oceans. They dominated the shallow seas, shaping coastlines and influencing global ecosystems. Yet their very success made them fragile. Reefs depend on balance: clear water, stable chemistry, and moderate temperatures. When those conditions shift, reefs can collapse quickly. During the Devonian, fluctuations in sea levels, changes in climate, and possibly shifts in atmospheric carbon dioxide place stress on reef systems. Toward the end of the Devonian, many reefs disappeared, victims of extinction events that swept through marine life. Their collapse marked one of the greatest ecological shifts of the era. But before that fall, they reigned as the richest habitats Earth had ever known. One striking feature of these reefs was how they shaped the evolution of fish. Reefs are full of hiding spots and obstacles, which meant that fish living in and around them had to become more agile. Ray-finned fish, with their delicate fins and precise control, were perfectly suited for weaving between corals. Lobe fins, heavier but stronger, could push themselves against reef rocks, using their sturdy fins for leverage. Predators refined ambush strategies, hiding among coral ridges to strike when prey ventured close. In this way, reefs became evolutionary laboratories, forcing fish to adapt in order to survive. Reefs also provided a stage for some of the earliest symbiotic relationships between animals. Just as today's corals partner with algae, Devonian reef builders likely benefited from similar alliances, using photosynthesis to boost their energy. Small invertebrates may have lived in close partnership with reef corals, feeding on waste or cleaning surfaces. These interdependent systems created a web of life more complex than anything the world had seen before. In many ways, the Devonian reefs were prototypes of the ecosystems we recognise in modern tropical seas. The role of reefs in the Devonian also extended beyond biology. By sequestering carbon dioxide into their skeletons, reef organisms played a part in regulating Earth's climate. As they grew, they locked away carbon, gradually altering the composition of the oceans and the atmosphere. The interplay between reefs, plants on land, and atmospheric chemistry created a feedback system that influenced global conditions. When reefs collapsed, that balance faltered, contributing to the stresses that drove mass extinctions. The story of reefs is not just about fish and corals, but about the entire Earth system in motion. Walking along a modern limestone cliff, you might see layers of rock patterned with the faint outlines of corals, sponges and shells. Those rocks are the remnants of Devonian reefs, long gone as living systems but still present in stone. It's humbling to realise that what once bustled with life now stands as quiet rock, holding the memory of oceans that no longer exist. The creatures that built those reefs never knew the scale of what they were creating, yet their efforts transformed landscapes and left marks that endure hundreds of millions of years later. For the fish and invertebrates of the Devonian, reefs were both sanctuary and trap. Sanctuary because they offered shelter from predators, places to hide and food to gather. Trap because predators knew the reefs too, lurking in crevices, ready to strike at anything careless enough to pass by. Life in the reefs was vibrant but perilous. To survive there, you needed agility, awareness, and often armour. That constant tension between safety and danger shaped the creatures who lived in these underwater kingdoms. What makes reefs so fascinating is how they demonstrate the power of cooperation in evolution. One coral polyp or one stromatoporoid sponge could do little alone. But together, millions of them created ecosystems that defined an age. Their skeletons supported others, their growth made homes for countless species, and their persistence shaped the course of evolution. The Devonian reefs remind us that some of the most influential forces in Earth's history come not from giants, but from the smallest builders working side by side. As the Devonian wore on, reefs reached their peak sprawling across equatorial seas. They became centres of activity, buzzing with life, shaping the destinies of fish, arthropods, mollusks and countless others. Their fall would be dramatic, but while they thrived, they were monuments to the creativity of evolution. To swim among them would have been to witness the greatest flourishing of marine life the world had seen so far. And while the reefs were exploding beneath the waves, another drama was unfolding above the waterline. Plants were continuing their steady march onto land, transforming barren rock into green landscapes, altering the air and setting the stage for forests. Just as reefs built new worlds under the sea, plants were building new worlds on land. Together they were reshaping the face of Earth in ways no animals had yet achieved. While the Devonian seas were blooming with reefs and fish of every shape, something just as revolutionary was happening above the waterline. For hundreds of millions of years, the continents had been barren, rocky expanses. They were landscapes of stone, sand, and bare soil, exposed to winds and rain, but almost lifeless except at the edges of rivers and wetlands. The only green you might have seen was in small patches of moss-like plants clinging close to the ground, little more than a thin skin of life scattered across otherwise empty terrain. But during the Devonian, that began to change. Plants, which had quietly crept onto land in earlier times, suddenly expanded into a full-scale invasion. Step by step, they transformed the continents from desolate wastelands into green worlds, reshaping the atmosphere, the soil, and eventually life itself. Imagine walking across a Devonian plain. Instead of dust and bare rock stretching to the horizon, you would see low carpets of green pushing outward. Small vascular plants, no taller than your ankles at first, sprouted along stream banks and across floodplains. Unlike the mosses and liverworts before them, these plants had stems stiffened with lignin, the tough compound that makes wood possible. They had vascular tissues that let them move water and nutrients efficiently, lifting them taller than their predecessors. For the first time, plants weren't limited to hugging the ground. They were reaching upward toward the sun. One of the earliest of these pioneers was Cooksonia. It was a simple plant by modern standards, just slender branching stems topped with spore-producing capsules, but it was a breakthrough. By growing upright, it could capture more light, scatter spores more effectively, and survive in areas its predecessors could not. From Cooksonia and its relatives came a whole wave of new forms, lycophytes, ferns, and early relatives of seed plants that gradually spread across the continents. Some reached heights of 1 metre or more, towering compared to the mosses before them. It may not sound like much, but to an arthropod crawling along the ground, these were jungles. The spread of plants didn't just add colour to the land, it rewrote the planet's systems. Roots pushed into soil and rock, breaking them apart, creating richer soils that could hold water and nutrients. Rivers that once shifted freely across barren landscapes became stabilised by vegetation along their banks. Plants trapped sediments, built up soils, and reshaped landscapes into more stable environments. With roots and stems holding ground in place, erosion slowed and entirely new ecosystems began to form. At the same time, plants altered the atmosphere. Through photosynthesis, they drew carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen. Before the Devonian, oxygen levels were much lower than they are today, and the air was not yet hospitable to large, active land animals. But as plants spread, oxygen levels began to climb and carbon dioxide fell. This shift had global consequences affecting climate, ocean chemistry, and the possibilities for future life. By the end of the Devonian, the Earth's atmosphere had been permanently altered, setting the stage for the rise of animals on land. The march of plants wasn't uniform everywhere. They spread first in low-lying areas, near rivers, lakes, and wetlands where water was plentiful. From there, they expanded gradually into drier areas, developing new strategies to survive. Some evolved leaves, flat surfaces that captured sunlight more efficiently. Others developed vascular systems that allowed them to move water farther, grow taller, and branch more extensively. Step by step, plants explored new niches, each innovation giving them a foothold in previously inhospitable terrain. As they spread, they created new opportunities for other forms of life. Arthropods, which had already begun to venture onto land in the Silurian, now found habitats rich in food and shelter. Millipedes could graze on decaying plant matter, scorpions could hide among stems, and early insects could begin exploring a green world. In the seas, fish had already exploded into diversity, but on land the first true ecosystems were just beginning to form. Without plants, there would have been nothing to support them. The Devonian also saw the rise of something extraordinary, the first trees. These were not trees as we think of them today, with leaves and flowers and complex branching systems, but they were tall, woody plants that reached several meters high. Archaeopteris is one of the best known, a tree-like plant that combined features of ferns with those of seed plants. It grew trunks, developed true wood, and formed the first forests. By the late Devonian, entire stands of trees covered parts of the continents, casting shade, dropping litter, and creating the first real forest soils. These forests were unlike anything Earth had seen before, and their impact was enormous. Forests changed the hydrology of the land. Rainfall that once ran off quickly into rivers was now absorbed into soils and slowly released. Forest litter built thick layers of organic material, which decomposed into rich soils that could support even more plants. Forests created microclimates, with cooler, moister air beneath their canopies. For arthropods and other early land animals, these forests were a revolution, offering food, shelter, and stability. For the atmosphere, forests accelerated the drawdown of carbon dioxide, contributing to global cooling. In fact, some scientists believe the spread of forests in the Devonian played a role in triggering the late Devonian glaciations and extinctions, by pulling so much carbon from the air that the climate tipped. It's remarkable to think how much of our own world traces back to that moment. The air we breathe today owes its oxygen to plants that began their expansion in the Devonian. The soils that feed crops, the rivers that run within their banks, the forests that cover continents, all are consequences of that ancient green invasion. Every blade of grass, every oak tree, every fern in a shady forest carries the genetic echoes of Devonian pioneers who first learned how to root, grow, and thrive on land. From the perspective of a Devonian fish looking towards shore, the transformation would have been dramatic. What had once been a barren, rocky coastline was now fringed with green. Plants rose above the waterline, their stems waving in the wind, their spores scattering into the air. The edges of rivers darkened with vegetation, and forests loomed in the distance. For fish beginning to explore shallow waters, these green zones offered new possibilities. Shade, fallen debris, and eventually even detritus washed into rivers created fresh habitats. The link between water and land was strengthening, and plants were at the heart of it. And as plants claimed the continents, they set in motion changes that would ripple through all future history. Animals would follow, first arthropods and then vertebrates. Forests would spread, altering climates and ecosystems. Carbon locked in soils and plant material would shape global chemistry. The Earth itself was becoming a green planet, and it has never gone back. The Devonian seas may have been ruled by fish, but the land was being claimed by plants. Their invasion was quiet, patient, and unstoppable. They didn't move quickly, they didn't roar like predators, but their impact was more profound than any predator's bite. By the end of the Devonian, the world was no longer barren. It was alive with forests buzzing with new life, and poised for the next great steps in evolution. And while plants were reshaping the land, they were also creating opportunities for the creatures that followed. Arthropods would take advantage of the new environments, creeping among roots and stems, experimenting with air-breathing and hunting strategies. Soon, vertebrates themselves would follow, their fins slowly transforming into limbs, their lungs adapting to air, their eyes learning to see above the waterline. The invasion of plants was not just about greenery. It was about opening the door for everything else that came next. When we imagine forests today, we think of familiar sights: oak and pine, cedar and birch, canopies of green leaves swaying in the wind, birdsong echoing through the branches, the smell of soil and moss underfoot. But go back to the Devonian, and forests looked nothing like that. They were alien by our standards, filled with tree-like plants that bore no flowers, no fruits, not even true leaves in many cases. Yet despite their strangeness, these first forests reshaped the Earth in ways as profound as any asteroid impact or tectonic shift. For hundreds of millions of years, the continents had been bare, except for low mats of mosses and tiny vascular plants that hugged riversides. But as the Devonian unfolded, plants became taller and sturdier, thanks to the invention of wood. The compound lignin, which stiffens plant tissues, allowed stems to rise higher and higher, no longer limited to a few centimetres above the ground. From those innovations came the first trees. They weren't trees in the sense we know them, with leaves fluttering in the wind, but they had trunks, they had branching crowns, and they reached heights of 10, 15, even 20 metres in some cases. One of the earliest and most influential was Archaeopteris. This tree combined traits of ferns with traits of seed plants. It had woody trunks, some over a metre in diameter, and leafy fronds that spread outward in layers. Unlike earlier plants that relied solely on spores, Archaeopteris produced seeds, giving it an advantage in reproduction. Seeds could survive longer in harsh conditions, spreading farther than delicate spores. This one innovation alone ensured that Archaeopteris could colonize vast areas, building the first true forests. Imagine walking into one of those Devonian forests. Instead of flowers and grasses, you'd find towering trunks rising into canopies of fern-like branches. The ground would be littered with decaying plant material, forming thick soils that were unlike anything the world had known before. The air under the canopy would be cooler, moister, filled with the scent of decomposing wood. There would be no bird song, no mammal calls, no rustling of reptiles, because those animals had not yet appeared. Instead, the sounds might come from the skittering of arthropods, scorpions, millipedes, and early insects, exploring the shaded floor. For them, this was a paradise of shelter and food. For the Earth, it was a revolution in progress. Forests changed the water cycle. Before trees, rain that fell on barren landscapes quickly ran off into rivers and seas. But trees intercepted rainfall with their canopies, slowed its descent, and guided it into soils. Roots absorbed water, stored it, and released it slowly. This stabilized rivers, created wetlands, and maintained steady groundwater. In turn, that provided more consistent habitats for both plants and animals. Forests made land ecologically richer, and with them came new complexity in ecosystems. Forests also changed the chemistry of the Earth itself. Through photosynthesis, they drew down immense amounts of carbon dioxide, releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. This wasn't just a subtle tweak, it was a major planetary shift. Carbon dioxide levels fell dramatically during the Devonian, partly because of the rise of forests. Oxygen levels rose, making the air more hospitable to larger, more active animals. At the same time, when forests shed leaves and trunks, the organic matter often became buried in sediments, locking carbon away in rocks. This long-term storage of carbon influenced global climate, and some researchers believe it may have even triggered the cooling events that led to the late Devonian mass extinctions. Forests, by flourishing, may have inadvertently reshaped the climate to the point of crisis. Their roots also broke rocks apart, accelerating the process of weathering. When roots penetrated cracks and secreted acids, they dissolved minerals, releasing nutrients into soils and rivers. Those nutrients fed ecosystems but also washed into oceans, where they could cause imbalances. Sudden nutrient influxes may have fueled algal blooms and oxygen depletion in marine environments, contributing to extinctions in the seas. Forests were both creators and destroyers, building new ecosystems while destabilizing others. What's striking about these early forests is how quickly they spread. Archaeopteryx alone became one of the most widespread plants in Earth's history, covering continents in dense stands. Its success was unmatched, and for millions of years it defined landscapes. These forests were not confined to equatorial regions. They stretched across much of the world, changing coastlines, stabilizing soils, and reshaping the flow of rivers. If you looked at Earth from space during the Devonian, you would see continents streaked with green, forests sprawling in patterns never seen before. The rise of forests also created new ecological opportunities for animals. Arthropods found abundant food in decaying litter. Millipedes could feast on fallen fronds, while predatory scorpions hunted among roots. Insects, still wingless in this period, crept across trunks and soils. The shaded understory offered microhabitats with stable moisture and temperature, allowing animals to explore niches that hadn't existed before. Eventually, vertebrates themselves would follow. Amphibians, descending from lobe-finned fish, would find forests welcoming with their damp soils and abundant prey. Without forests, the colonization of land by vertebrates might have been delayed by millions of years. Forests didn't just transform the land, they influenced the oceans as well. Rivers flowing through forested regions carried sediments and nutrients into the seas, changing marine chemistry. The collapse of reefs at the end of the Devonian may have been partly linked to these changes. It's a reminder that ecosystems are interconnected. What happens on land reverberates in the oceans, and what happens in the oceans affects the land. The Devonian was the first time that connection was so powerfully demonstrated, and forests were at the heart of it. When we study fossil forests today, we find evidence of their immense impact. In New York, Gilboa holds the remains of some of the world's oldest forests, their stumps preserved in stone. Standing among them, you can trace the outlines of roots that once anchored towering trunks, roots that broke rock apart, fed soils, and changed the world. In other regions, fossilized wood shows the structure of Archaeopteryx, its rings revealing growth patterns year by year. These fossils are not just relics of plants, but records of Earth's first true forests, the moment when the continents turned green in earnest. It's strange to think that the green landscapes we take for granted are the product of such ancient experiments. Every forest today, from Amazon jungles to boreal pines, carries the legacy of Devonian pioneers. Their invention of wood, their ability to grow tall, their creation of seeds, all of it laid the foundation for the ecosystems we now depend on. Without those forests, there would be no oxygen-rich atmosphere, no soils deep enough for agriculture, no vast stores of carbon locked away in coal. In many ways, our civilization rests on the achievements of Devonian trees. If you had stood at the edge of one of those forests and looked inward, it would have felt both familiar and alien. Trunks rose high, but the foliage was strange, fern-like fronds, no true leaves, no flowers. The forest floor was damp and dark, littered with decaying plant matter, but quiet without the hum of insects or the calls of birds. And yet, in that silence, you would have sensed the magnitude of what was happening. This was not just a patch of plants. This was the birth of forests, and with them, the birth of a new Earth. Forests would continue to evolve after the Devonian, giving rise to seed ferns, gymnosperms, and eventually flowering plants. But the first great transformation happened here. In the age of fishes, it was the trees that remade the continents, turning stone into soil, air into oxygen, and landscapes into living worlds. Their shadow stretches to us even now, in every breath we take and every forest we walk through. And while forests rose above the ground, life at their feet was changing too. Arthropods grew larger, exploring new niches. Amphibians would soon begin their cautious steps into the undergrowth. The world was no longer divided into lifeless land and living seas. It was becoming a planet of interconnected ecosystems, green and thriving in ways it had never been before. While trees were beginning to climb into the sky and forests stretched across the continents, the ground beneath them was slowly filling with the first waves of animal life. For hundreds of millions of years, the land had been almost silent, barren except for plants and microbes. But as green spread outward, so did the creatures bold enough to leave the seas behind. They weren't vertebrates, not yet. Before any fish ever pushed itself onto land, arthropods were already there, creeping among roots, scuttling over soil, and testing out a new kind of world. Millipedes, scorpions, and other early crawlers were among the first pioneers, and in their movements, they rewrote what was possible for life. It's worth imagining how different land must have seemed to a creature adapted to water. In the oceans, bodies are buoyed up by water, oxygen comes dissolved through gills, and moisture surrounds everything. On land, gravity pulls harder, air is thin and dry, and bodies risk drying out with every breath. To make the leap, creatures needed new solutions. Arthropods were well prepared. Their exoskeletons, made of chitin, acted as armour against desiccation, holding moisture in and giving them structure against gravity. Jointed legs allowed them to move over uneven terrain, pushing across soil and rock where fish would only flop helplessly. For them, the land was a challenge, but not an impossible one. Among the first to claim it were millipedes. Fossil tracks show that by the mid-Devonian these many-legged grazers were crawling across the forest floor. Some of them grew to remarkable sizes, several centimetres thick and up to 2 metres long in later periods. The Devonian forms were smaller, but still striking. They fed on decaying plant matter, recycling organic material into soils and forming the first detritus-based ecosystems on land. Millipedes were nature's first composters, breaking down fallen fronds and trunks, enriching soils, and making nutrients available for other organisms. Without them and their successors, forests might have been choked with debris, their cycles less efficient. Alongside them were scorpions, predators of the undergrowth. These early scorpions were among the first animals to fully adapt to breathing air. Their book lungs, layers of tissue folded like the pages of a book, absorbed oxygen directly from the atmosphere. Some of them still returned to water, hunting in shallow pools, but others were firmly terrestrial, prowling the shaded roots of forests in search of prey. They carried stingers just as their descendants do today, delivering venom to subdue smaller arthropods. In a world without reptiles, without amphibians, without mammals or birds, the scorpions were among the top predators of the land. There were also centipedes, cousins of the millipedes, but far more aggressive. Unlike their slow, plant-feeding relatives, centipedes were swift hunters, their bodies armed with venomous fangs adapted from front legs. They preyed on smaller invertebrates, chasing them across soil and leaf litter. Their segmented bodies and rapid legs made them efficient predators, filling a niche no vertebrate had yet claimed. In the absence of larger land predators, even small centipedes were formidable. Insects too had begun to appear. They were wingless in the Devonian, simple in form, creeping along the forest floor or climbing plant stems. Their diversity was still limited, but they represented another step in the invasion of the land. Wings would come later, in the Carboniferous, bringing with them the sound of buzzing skies, but the foundation was already laid. These small insects tested out feeding strategies, some grazing on plants, others scavenging, others preying on smaller arthropods. Together, these arthropods formed the first terrestrial food webs. Plants produced organic matter, millipedes and other detritivores broke it down. Predators like scorpions and centipedes hunted them, and the cycle continued. It was a simple system compared to modern ecosystems, but it was enough to establish land as a viable place to live. Once the door was open, other creatures would follow, each wave building on the success of those before. Their arrival on land also shaped the forests themselves. By feeding on decaying material, millipedes and their kin kept the forest floor clear, recycling nutrients back into soils. Predators like scorpions controlled populations of smaller creatures, maintaining balance. Their burrowing and crawling helped mix soils, improving aeration and structure. In countless subtle ways, these crawlers engineered the environments they inhabited, making them richer and more complex. It's fascinating to consider how quiet those landscapes must have been. Today, a walk through a forest is filled with sound. Birds, frogs, insects, mammals. But in the Devonian, there was no bird song, no buzzing of wings, no chorus of amphibians. The loudest sounds might have been the rustle of fronds in the wind, the creak of trees, and the faint scuttling of arthropods across litter. Yet within that quiet, revolutions were happening. Each millipede trail, each scorpion hunt, was part of a larger shift that would redefine life on Earth. Their fossils give us glimpses of that story. Tracks preserved in ancient sediments show the pathways of millipedes moving across damp ground. Fossilized exoskeletons reveal the size and structure of scorpions, some surprisingly large. These remains tell us that arthropods were not timid visitors, but established residents, shaping the land long before vertebrates ever emerged from the water. The significance of this invasion cannot be overstated. By moving onto land, arthropods proved it could be done. They developed the structures and strategies needed to breathe air, resist drying, and move on solid ground. They showed that land could support ecosystems, not just scattered plants. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for vertebrates to follow. When fish began their own tentative steps onto shore, they were entering a world already inhabited by arthropods, a world where prey and predators already moved among the roots. It's also a reminder that not all pioneers are the largest or the most powerful. The first creatures to claim land were not towering dinosaurs or roaring mammals. They were small crawlers, often no longer than your hand, moving quietly but persistently. Their success came not from size but from adaptability, from exoskeletons that held moisture, from lungs that breathed air, from legs that could carry them across uneven terrain. Evolution often advances in these quiet ways, through small creatures solving big problems. As forests spread and arthropods diversified, the stage was set for even greater transformations. Amphibians would soon follow, their lobe-finned ancestors pushing up from shallow pools, their lungs and limbs adapting to a new way of life. Reptiles, mammals, and eventually humans would come much later. But the path was first cleared by millipedes munching on decaying fronds, by scorpions raising their stingers in the shade of trees, by insects creeping up stems in search of food. They were the first true citizens of the land, and everything that followed owes them a debt. When you see a scorpion today, or a millipede winding its way through soil, or an insect climbing a blade of grass, you're looking at living echoes of that ancient invasion. They are reminders that long before vertebrates made land their home, arthropods had already claimed it. They built the first terrestrial ecosystems, they recycled the first forest litter, they hunted the first land prey. In their quiet persistence, they turned the continents from barren rock into living landscapes, and as the Devonian continued, their presence on land would intertwine with the dramas unfolding in the seas. Fish were diversifying at an unprecedented pace, experimenting with new forms, new strategies, new possibilities. The age of fishes was surging forward, and while arthropods scuttled through forests, under the waves an even greater explosion of diversity was taking place. The Devonian is often called the Age of Fishes, and for good reason. Never before in Earth's history had the oceans been so crowded with experiments in body plans, strategies and lifestyles. The seas of the Silurian had already been lively, but compared to what came after, they were a prologue. In the Devonian, fish didn't just survive, they blossomed into an astonishing array of forms, filling every niche from shallow reefs to open oceans, from rivers to lagoons. It was as if life had opened a vast new toolbox, and every design was being tested at once. Picture a reef lagoon, sunlight filtering through the clear water. Schools of small ray-finned fish shimmer together, darting as one when a shadow passes. Lobe-finned fish, heavier but more deliberate, lurk near rocks, their fleshy fins pushing against the seafloor as they wait to ambush prey. Sharks, still early in their design, slice through the water with sudden bursts of speed, their bodies lighter than bone-armoured rivals. Above them, placoderms patrol with their thick plates, jaws ready to shear through flesh and armour alike. Every corner of the water is alive, every niche filled by some fish or another. One of the great stories of the Devonian is the rise of the actinopterygians, or ray-finned fish. They may have been small and less imposing than placoderms or sharks, but their design proved almost endlessly adaptable. Their fins, supported by thin rays of bone, allowed incredible precision in movement. They could hover, dart, turn sharply, and swim with efficiency. This agility made them perfect for weaving through reefs and navigating complex environments. In the Devonian, they were only beginning to diversify, but even then their potential was clear. Today, they account for over 99% of fish species, from salmon to seahorses, and it all began with their humble Devonian ancestors, in contrast with the Secopterygians, or lobe-finned fish. Their fins were not delicate fans, but fleshy appendages with sturdy bones inside, precursors to arms and legs. These fish weren't as quick or agile as the ray fins, but they had power. Their fins allowed them to push along the bottom, to prop themselves up in shallow water, to manoeuvre in ways that hinted at a future beyond the sea. Among them were lungfish, who developed the ability to gulp air in oxygen-poor waters, and coelacanths, who swam with a distinctive, almost walking motion of their paired fins. These lobe fins would eventually give rise to tetrapods, the four-limbed animals that include amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals. In the Devonian, they were just another branch of the fish explosion, but their significance would echo into every future era. Placoderms, the armoured fish, still thrived during this time, ranging from small species grazing in reefs to giants like Dunkleosteus patrolling the seas. Their diversity was impressive, with some specialised for bottom feeding, others for swift predation. Their armour made them heavy, but their dominance was undeniable. For tens of millions of years they were among the most successful fish on the planet, a testament to the power of armour and jaws. Sharks, too, were spreading into new forms. Early species like Cladocelash pioneered the sleek, streamlined body plan that would carry their descendants through 400 million years of ocean history. They were not yet the massive hunters of later times, but their speed and sensory abilities gave them an edge. As placoderms declined toward the end of the Devonian, sharks were poised to rise further, eventually becoming the enduring predators we know today. This diversity wasn't confined to the oceans alone. Fish were colonizing freshwater rivers and lakes, adapting to new conditions. In rivers, they faced currents and seasonal fluctuations, leading to new strategies in body shape and behavior. Some developed air-breathing capabilities to survive in stagnant or oxygen-poor waters. Others evolved body forms suited for clinging to rocks or navigating fast-moving streams. The expansion into freshwater was as significant as the spread of plants onto land, because it opened new frontiers for evolution. Eventually, freshwater environments would become the staging ground for vertebrates to step onto land itself. What's striking about the Devonian fish explosion is how much experimentation was happening at once. Some fish carried heavy armour, others shed it for speed. Some relied on lungs, others perfected gills. Some built crushing jaws for hard prey, others developed fine teeth for slicing. Evolution seemed to be running a grand contest of designs, seeing what worked best in different environments. In truth, many worked, at least for a while. Placoderms thrived until extinctions wiped them out. Lobe fins ventured toward land. Ray fins quietly laid the groundwork for future dominance. Sharks refined themselves into efficient hunters. Each success built on the innovations of earlier experiments, layering complexity into marine ecosystems. The ecosystems themselves became more intricate. In earlier times, food webs were relatively simple. Small animals eaten by bigger ones, with few specialized roles. But in the Devonian, fish diversity added depth. Some grazed on plants or algae, others sifted through sediment for tiny invertebrates. Mid-level predators hunted small fish, while apex predators like Dunkleosteus ruled at the top. This complexity stabilized ecosystems, making them more resilient but also more sensitive to disruptions. The Devonian seas were teeming with interactions, rivalries and dependencies, a true aquarium of wonders on a global scale. If you were to drift through a Devonian sea, you would witness scenes that seem both familiar and alien. Schools of small ray fins flashing like modern sardines, yet without the refined diversity of today. Lobe fins resting on the bottom, their fins flexing as if preparing for a step. Sharks gliding with recognizable grace, though smaller and simpler than their descendants. Placoderms dominating reefs with their armoured bulk, creatures with faces that look almost mechanical to our eyes. The ocean would feel alive in every direction, a kaleidoscope of forms in constant motion. Fossils from this time capture that diversity in astonishing detail. Sites in Germany, Morocco, Canada and China preserve entire fish assemblages, showing the variety of shapes and strategies. Some fossils reveal delicate fin rays, others show powerful jaws or armour plates. In some places, entire ecosystems have been preserved, frozen snapshots of Devonian life that remind us just how rich those seas were. Every fossil is a fragment of the greater picture, a world where fish were not just surviving, but exploding into possibilities. It's tempting to ask why this happened then. Why the Devonian, and not earlier or later? Part of the answer lies in the combination of innovations already underway. Jaws, fins, armour, cartilage, lungs. Each had appeared in some form before, but in the Devonian they converged, creating a perfect storm of evolutionary opportunity. Add to that the stability of warm, shallow seas, the abundance of reef habitats, and the expansion of freshwater environments, and the stage was set for an evolutionary burst. Life seized the chance, and the oceans became crowded with experiments. The legacy of this explosion is hard to overstate. Almost every major lineage of fish alive today can trace its roots back to the Devonian. Sharks, ray fins, lobe fins, all began their major diversifications then. Even groups that eventually vanished, like placoderms, left their mark by shaping ecosystems and driving arms races in evolution. The Devonian didn't just produce fish diversity, it set the blueprint for vertebrate life as we know it. And as fish were testing out their futures in the water, the world above continued to change as well. Plants were rising higher, forests spreading wider, arthropods crawling farther into the green undergrowth. The land and sea were no longer separate theatres. They were connected, each influencing the other. Nutrients washed from forests into rivers, feeding aquatic life. Fish ventured into freshwater, influenced by the environments plants had stabilised. The great story of Earth's biosphere was becoming more unified, more complex, more interdependent. When we look at our own place in this history, it's humbling to realise that our ancestors swam in those Devonian seas. Somewhere among the lobe-finned fish was the lineage that would eventually crawl onto land, sprout limbs, and walk. The explosion of fish diversity wasn't just an event in natural history. It was the branching of the tree that would one day lead to us. Every breath we take, every step we make, carries the legacy of those Devonian fish who first learned to thrive in water in so many different ways. The Devonian aquarium of wonders was dazzling, but it was also fragile. As we move forward, we'll see that not all of those experiments lasted. Extinctions would sweep through, wiping away entire groups, collapsing reefs, and reshaping ecosystems. But before those crises struck, life in the Devonian oceans reached a peak of creativity that still inspires awe. Among all the fish that fill the Devonian seas, some were destined for a future that no one could have predicted. They did not look especially dominant at first glance. They weren't the fastest swimmers like sharks, nor the heaviest armoured like placoderms, nor even the most numerous like the ray fins. But they carried within their fins something extraordinary, something that would change the course of life on Earth. These were the lobe-finned fish, the sarcopterygians, and from their stout, fleshy fins came the arms and legs of every tetrapod that ever walked the land. At first sight, a lobe-finned fish might not strike you as remarkable. Their bodies were often thick and muscular, with fins supported not just by rays but by a central set of bones. Instead of delicate fans that fanned out like feathers, their fins were meaty lobes, jointed at the base, with internal structures that resembled the beginnings of limbs. They could not walk, not yet, but they could push. They could brace themselves against the bottom, manoeuvre in shallow water, and even prop up parts of their bodies. It was a modest ability at the time, useful for life in lagoons, estuaries, and swampy margins, but it was also the seed of something far greater. Among these fish were the coelacanths, with their distinctive flicking tails and paired fins that moved almost like limbs in a walking gait. They swam with an undulating rhythm, their fins rotating in pairs left and right, like the motion of walking across a floor. Today, coelacanths survive in deep oceans, living fossils of a lineage once thought extinct. But in the Devonian they were part of the great wave of lobe-finned diversity. Their design showed just how versatile lobes could be, balancing strength with manoeuvrability. Another group, the lungfish, carried the story even further. They evolved the ability to breathe air. In stagnant waters low in oxygen, where gills alone were not enough, lungfish gulped air into simple lungs, surviving conditions that would have suffocated other fish. Their lobed fins allowed them to move clumsily across the bottoms of ponds, to survive droughts by burrowing into mud, to persist when others perished. To us today, they may look unassuming, but their combination of lungs and lobe fins was revolutionary. It made them survivors, bridging the gap between water and land. But the most significant lobe fins were those that experimented with pushing themselves further toward the shoreline. In shallow waters, especially in floodplains and swamps, fins that could brace against the bottom were invaluable. A fish could lift itself enough to gulp air, to wriggle through weeds, to reach new pools when waters shrank. Over generations, those fins became sturdier, their bones more pronounced. What began as paddles turned slowly into proto-limbs, jointed structures capable of supporting weight. These fish did not walk in the sense we understand, but they were learning the mechanics of locomotion on solid ground. One of the most famous of these pioneers was Eusthenopteron. It looked like a fish, but inside its fins were bones that foreshadowed the pattern of arm, forearm and wrist. Its skull carried traits that would later appear in amphibians, and its body was built for navigating shallow waters, where such adaptations were most useful. Another was Panderichthys, with a flatter body and eyes positioned more toward the top of its head, suited for lurking near surfaces and scanning the world above water. These were fish on the threshold, testing forms that would eventually leave the sea behind. Perhaps the most iconic of them all was Tiktaalik, discovered in the Canadian Arctic. Tiktaalik was not yet a true tetrapod, but it was no ordinary fish either. It had a flat skull with eyes on top, strong ribs that could support its body, and pectoral fins with bones that resembled a shoulder, elbow and wrist. Its fins could not walk on land in a modern sense, but they could prop it up, allowing it to push along the bottom or even clamber onto mudflats. Tiktaalik represents a moment when the line between fish and tetrapod blurred almost completely. When evolution was drafting the blueprint for life beyond water, the environments these lobe fins inhabited tell us much about why their traits were so useful. Devonian floodplains were dynamic places, with rivers swelling and shrinking, ponds drying in dry seasons, and shallow waters often deprived of oxygen. In such conditions, a fish that could breathe air had an immense advantage. A fish that could push itself from one pool to another, however clumsily, could survive when others stranded. Selection favoured resilience and innovation, and the lobe fins provided both. It's easy to romanticise this story as a march toward land, as if evolution was always aiming for amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and eventually humans. But in truth, these adaptations were responses to immediate challenges. Gills failed in stagnant waters, so lungs evolved. Fins couldn't support enough weight, so stronger lobes developed. Each step was about surviving in the present, not planning for the future, and yet by solving problems of the Devonian, these fish unknowingly laid the groundwork for every tetrapod that followed. The significance of lobe fins extends beyond anatomy. Their existence reshaped ecosystems. With their ability to exploit shallow and marginal habitats, they expanded the range of vertebrate life. They pushed into areas where other fish could not go, linking aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems more closely. When they finally did step onto land, they carried with them predators and prey dynamics that would transform terrestrial life forever. Fossils of these lobe fins are found across the world, each revealing part of the story. Their bones show the gradual strengthening of fin structures, the widening of skulls, the development of ribs, the transition of sensory systems. Some retain clear fish traits, others lean toward amphibian forms, but together they trace a continuum. Evolution did not draw a sharp line between fish and tetrapods. It blended one into the other, over millions of years, until the difference became clear only in hindsight. When we look at our own limbs today, we see the echoes of these pioneers. The bones of our arms, humerus, radius, ulna, wrist, digits, all trace back to the architecture of lobe-finned fish. Every step we take on land, every grasp we make with our hands, is possible because of the experiments carried out in Devonian swamps. Even our lungs, our way of breathing air, are tied to the same lineage. To know the lobe fins is to know ourselves, not as an abstraction but as a direct inheritance of form and function. It's humbling to imagine one of these fish lifting itself up on its fins, peering with upward-facing eyes at the green shoreline of a Devonian forest. It was not striving to become an amphibian or a mammal. It was simply surviving, moving from one pool to another, perhaps snapping at insects on the bank, perhaps waiting for the next flood. Yet in that moment the trajectory of life shifted. From such creatures came salamanders and lizards, dinosaurs and birds, whales and humans. The Devonian was not just the age of fishes, it was the age when fish began to imagine, in their bodies if not their minds, a life beyond the water. And while lobe-fins were pioneering new ways of living, they were still part of the bustling aquarium of Devonian seas. They swam alongside armoured placoderms, darted away from sharks and shared reefs with ray fins. They were one branch among many, but their branch would extend far beyond the Devonian, carrying vertebrates into forests, across continents, and eventually into every corner of the earth. Breathing seems simple to us now. We hardly think about it. The steady rhythm of lungs pulling in oxygen and pushing out carbon dioxide, a background hum of life. But in the Devonian, breathing was a frontier. For fish, the ability to draw oxygen from water had long been their lifeline. Gills served them well, delicate tissues that pulled dissolved oxygen from water with remarkable efficiency. Yet the Devonian world was not always kind to gill breathers. Shallow pools often ran stagnant. Rivers warmed in the sun and lost their oxygen. Droughts left ponds shrinking to muddy puddles. In these places, gills alone were not enough. To survive, some fish turned to a different strategy. They began to breathe air. The story of lungs and gills begins far earlier than the Devonian, in the first jawless fish that developed simple outpouchings of the gut to store and regulate gases. These structures may have started as swim bladders, helping fish control buoyancy, but in some lineages they took on another role. They became primitive lungs, sacs that could hold air and extract oxygen when gills failed. In the Devonian, these traits became life-saving. For fish stranded in warm, shallow waters, gulping air could mean the difference between life and death. Lungfish are perhaps the clearest example of this adaptation. Even today they survive in Africa, South America and Australia, clinging to a lineage that began in the Devonian. Their lungs are not secondary to gills, they are primary. In fact, some modern lungfish can drown if forced to remain underwater without access to air. In the Devonian, lungfish used their lungs to endure oxygen-poor environments. When droughts came, some burrowed into mud, cocooned themselves, and waited out the dry season, breathing air until the waters returned. They were living experiments in a dual system, able to pull oxygen from both water and air depending on the need. Coelacanths, their lobe-finned cousins, carried vestiges of lungs too. Modern coelacanths still have a lung-like organ, though in them it has become vestigial, replaced by a fatty structure for buoyancy. But their ancestors in the Devonian likely used both gills and lungs, a combination that reflects the transitional state of many fish of that time. Breathing was not a single invention but a spectrum of solutions, each shaped by local environments. Even among ray-finned fish, lungs played a role. Early forms carried lung-like sacs, though in many lineages these evolved into swim bladders used for buoyancy rather than respiration. It's a reminder that evolution repurposes structures again and again. What begins as a lung can become a flotation device. What begins as a fin can become a limb. In the Devonian, these transformations were underway, with fish testing out the boundaries of water and air. The mechanics of gills and lungs tell us why this mattered. Gills are extraordinary at pulling oxygen from water, but they are fragile and dependent on constant flow. In stagnant water with low oxygen levels, they become useless. Lungs, on the other hand, thrive in air but are cumbersome in water, requiring new circulatory adaptations and ways of ventilating. A fish with both could straddle environments, breathing through gills when water was plentiful, switching to lungs when conditions worsened. In a world of fluctuating rivers and seasonal droughts, that flexibility was survival. Tiktaalik and its kin show evidence of such dual systems. Their bones suggest strong ribs that may have supported lungs, while still retaining functional gills. They were not abandoning water but hedging their bets, carrying two systems that allowed them to explore marginal habitats. It was not about conquest at first, it was about resilience. The world was unpredictable, and those who could breathe in more than one way had the edge. The consequences of this innovation were profound. Breathing air opened access to new environments, from swampy shallows to floodplains. It also paved the way for locomotion on land. A fish that could gulp air could linger in shallows without fear of suffocating, giving it time to experiment with pushing itself across mud. Over generations, those experiments became the foundations of tetrapods. Lungs were not just about oxygen, they were about freedom, about unshackling life from the strict limits of water. But even as lungs spread, gills remained indispensable. No fish could simply discard them, not yet. In fact, many species developed ways to use both at once. Gills worked underwater, lungs took over when water ran low, and together they created a redundancy that ensured survival. The Devonian was an age of dualities, fish with both fins and proto-limbs, both gills and lungs, both water and air as their realms. It was an age of experimentation, where nothing was settled and everything was possible. The fossil record gives us glimpses of these transitions. Skull structures show openings for both gills and air passages. Rib cages grow more robust, suggesting the support of lungs. Some species preserve impressions of soft tissues that hint at sacs and chambers inside their bodies. Piece by piece, we reconstruct a world where breathing was not a simple matter but a spectrum of strategies. When you breathe in deeply today, your lungs filling with air, you're enacting a legacy that began in these fish. The very act of breathing, so automatic to us, is built on innovations that were tested in Devonian swamps and rivers. Without those early lungs, there would be no mammals, no birds, no reptiles, no amphibians. Every inhale is a connection to fish that gulped at the surface of ancient ponds, desperate for oxygen in a world where water could no longer guarantee it. It's tempting to see this as a triumphant march toward land, but in truth, it was fragile and tentative. Many lineages experimented with lungs and failed. Some kept them only to lose them again. Some evolved partial systems that were abandoned. Evolution is never a straight line. It is a branching tree, with countless twigs broken off along the way. The survivors are just one story among many, one thread that happened to carry forward. And yet, that one thread carried so much. It connected the Devonian to the Carboniferous, where amphibians would stride among towering ferns. It connected shallow pools to forests, rivers to continents. It connected fish to humans. Lungs were not just an adaptation, they were a door, one that opened onto a world that had never been walked before. Meanwhile, in the seas, gills continued to serve billions of fish, as they still do today. The majority of aquatic life never abandoned them, never needed lungs. For them, the ocean remained their world, and gills remained their lifeline. The beauty of evolution is that it never chooses one path exclusively. It keeps many open, letting each find its own way. The Devonian was filled with both, gill breathers and lung breathers, swimmers and proto-walkers, a mosaic of possibilities coexisting in one age. If you could stand on a Devonian riverbank and watch, you might see a lungfish rise to the surface, gulping a bubble of air before sinking back into the weeds. You might see a coelacanth flick its paired fins, its lungs hidden but still present within its body. You might see a shallow water lobe-fin prop itself up, breathing through both gills and primitive lungs as it shifted from pool to pool. To your eyes, it would be a strange mix of familiar and alien, but to them, it was simply life as they knew it. Survival in a world always changing, and as lungs spread, as gills endured, as dual systems flourished, the stage was being set for something greater still. Eyes would turn upward, adapting to air and light. Fins would stiffen into limbs, carrying bodies onto new terrain. The Devonian was not just the age of fishes. It was the age when fish began to imagine air as part of their world. The Devonian was an age of transitions, and one of the most remarkable was not in bones or lungs or fins, but in vision. For hundreds of millions of years, eyes had been tuned to underwater life. Light behaves differently in water than in air. It bends more strongly, scatters differently, and filters through layers of suspended particles. To see underwater, eyes evolved with certain expectations that the world would be dimmer, that distances would blur more quickly, that colours would fade the deeper you went. But in the Devonian, as fish began to linger in shallow water and lift their heads toward the surface, those expectations no longer matched the reality above. Air was clearer, brighter, sharper. Objects stood out at greater distances and colours remained vivid. For the first time in vertebrate history, fish were beginning to peer into this new realm. It might seem like a small thing, a fish lifting its eyes above water, but in evolutionary terms it was profound. Eyes are not passive, they shape behaviour. An animal that can see farther hunts differently, hides differently, lives differently. When lobe-finned fish in shallow swamps and estuaries began to tilt their heads upward, their eyes started to face challenges that water-adapted vision couldn't fully meet. And so, slowly, subtly, vision itself began to change. Fossils tell this story in the placement of the eyes. Earlier fish often had eyes on the sides of their heads, suited for scanning wide fields of view in the water, spotting predators from many angles. But some Devonian lobe fins began to shift their eyes upward toward the tops of their skulls. Panderichthys is a striking example. Its flat head, with eyes positioned high, suggests it spent much of its time close to the water's surface, peering upward into air or scanning the shallows. This was not yet the gaze of a land animal, but it was a gaze that anticipated land. Why look upward? In shallow, oxygen-poor waters, fish that rose to the surface to gulp air also had reason to scan above. Perhaps they watched for insects skimming across the surface, a new food source. Perhaps they sought to avoid predators that might strike from above, like giant arthropods exploring the margins. Or perhaps the act of raising the head simply made it practical for eyes to adjust. Whatever the reasons, the result was the same. Vision was being drawn into two worlds at once. Eyes that work in water do not automatically work in air. The cornea, the clear outer surface of the eye, bends light differently in the two mediums. Underwater, the lens provides most of the refraction needed for focusing. In air, the cornea takes over much of that job. A fisheye lifted above water might see only a blur at first. But over time, small changes in shape and structure improved focus in both environments. It wasn't a complete solution. The earliest amphibians likely had imperfect vision in air compared to modern animals, but it was enough. Evolution rarely delivers perfection immediately. It delivers adequacy, and adequacy is enough to survive. One fascinating clue comes from the size of the eyes. Fossils of early tetrapods and their fish relatives often show relatively large eye sockets compared to earlier fish. Larger eyes meant more light gathered, sharper vision, and better ability to detect contrasts. For an animal exploring the margins of water and land, this was invaluable. Big eyes could pick out prey on muddy banks, watch for movement in dim light, and scan a wider range. In the Devonian, larger eyes were not just ornaments. They were tools for survival in a shifting world. Modern comparisons help us imagine this transition. Mud skippers, those odd amphibious fish alive today, spend much of their lives out of water. Their eyes sit high on their heads, bulging outward, able to swivel and scan the air above the mud flats. They are not descended directly from Devonian lobe fins, but they give us a living analogue of what it might have looked like when fish began to adapt their gaze to air. Watching a mud skipper blink its eyes clear of mud, then dart its vision across land and water alike, is like watching a Devonian experiment replayed in miniature. This shift in vision also intertwined with behaviour. Seeing above the waterline encouraged exploration. A fish that could spot insects or small arthropods near shore might be tempted to lunge at them, propelling itself partway out of the water. A fish that could spot danger earlier had more time to react, to retreat to safety, or to seek new habitats. Vision didn't just reflect the world, It opened possibilities in it. As eyes adjusted to air, bodies followed, experimenting with fins that could support weight, lungs that could hold oxygen, and eventually limbs that could carry animals fully onto land. It's important to remember that this was not a sudden transformation. No fish woke up one day with perfect air vision. These were gradual adjustments, small shifts over countless generations. A slightly flatter skull here, a slightly larger eye there, a tweak in corneal curvature, a change in lens size. Each was minor on its own, but together they created animals that could not only breathe in air and push themselves upward, but also see where they were going. Without vision adapting alongside lungs and limbs, the conquest of land would have been far riskier. Fossils like those of Tiktaalik add further depth to the story. Tiktaalik's skull was broad and flat, with eyes set toward the top, a classic sign of surface-dwelling habits. It likely lurked in shallow waters, ambushing prey near the edges. To do so, it would have needed to see both below and above the surface, watching for fish in the water and for potential meals or threats near the shore. This dual vision made Tiktaalik an apex ambush predator of its environment, blending the advantages of both realms. The link between eyes and lungs is more intimate than it seems. Both represent ways of dealing with air. Lungs let fish extract oxygen from it, while eyes let them interpret the brighter, sharper world it revealed. Together they expanded what was possible. A fish that could breathe but not see would struggle to survive on land. A fish that could see but not breathe would suffocate. The pairing of lungs and air-adapted eyes created a synergy, each reinforcing the other. This is how evolution works. Not in isolation, but in interconnected systems that reinforce survival. The impact of this transition is still with us. Our own eyes are tuned to air, with corneas and lenses perfectly shaped for focusing light in our atmosphere. Our binocular vision, our ability to gauge depth and distance, our colour perception, all have roots in that ancient transition. We are air seers because Devonian fish began to look upward. Every time we look at a horizon, gaze at the stars, or watch the flight of a bird, we are enacting a sensory heritage that began with eyes tilting toward the skies of the Devonian. There is also a poetic symmetry in this story. Life began in the seas. Eyes first evolved in aquatic creatures, and for eons they knew nothing but water. Then, slowly, eyes discovered air, light sharper than ever, distances longer, horizons wider. It was as if life itself was lifting its head for the first time, realizing there was more beyond the ripples. That moment did not belong to one fish or one species, but to many, scattered across shallow waters of a planet in transition. Together, they shifted the perspective of life forever. If you could stand on a Devonian bank, you might see a lobe-finned fish resting in the shallows, its body half submerged, its eyes peering above the surface. The forest behind it would stretch upward, shadows falling across the water. Insects might skitter across the mud, and the fish would watch, its gaze catching both the shimmer of light underwater and the bright outlines of air. That glance, unremarkable in the moment, was history unfolding. From it came the gaze of amphibians on fern-lined shores, the sharp eyes of reptiles watching from rocks, the keen sight of birds in flight, the watchful eyes of mammals hunting across plains. From it came our own ability to see the world we live in now, and as eyes turned upward, as vision adjusted to this new realm, the next steps became inevitable. Fins that could prop became fins that could push. Lungs that could gulp became lungs that could sustain. Bodies followed where eyes first looked. The Devonian was not only the age of fish filling the seas, it was the age of fish beginning to imagine, with their eyes, a world beyond them. By the middle of the Devonian, the oceans were already bursting with diversity. Sharks hunted with speed. Placoderms patrolled in armour. Ray-finned fish darted with delicate precision, and lobe-fins experimented with lungs, eyes, and ways of moving in shallow water. Among all these forms, one stood out as a symbol of transition. It was not the largest or the fiercest. It wasn't even fully on land. But in its bones, in its flat head, in its fins that were almost limbs, Tiktaalik carried the blueprint of a new world. Tiktaalik lived around 375 million years ago in what are now the Canadian Arctic Islands. At the time, those regions were near the equator, warm and swampy, filled with rivers, floodplains and shallow deltas. It was an environment perfect for creatures caught between water and land, places where ponds dried and refilled, where shallow pools warmed and lost oxygen, where survival depended on flexibility. Tiktaalik thrived in these in-between spaces. It was not a full land animal, but it was not entirely a fish either. It was something in the middle, a creature that carried the memory of the sea in its gills and fins, but the promise of land in its lungs and proto-limbs. At first glance, Tiktaalik looked like a fish. It had scales covering its body, fins instead of legs, and gills to breathe underwater. But its head told another story. Unlike most fish, Tiktaalik had a flat skull with eyes on top like a crocodile. This suggested it spent much of its time lurking near the surface, peering both into water and above it. Its skull also had a neck, a feature absent in most fish. Where fish skulls are fused directly to their shoulders, Tiktaalik's was separated, allowing it to lift and turn its head. On land, where movement is less buoyed by water, being able to lift the head independently is a huge advantage. In Tiktaalik, this was already happening. Its ribs were another clue. They were robust and expanded, capable of supporting its body and protecting lungs. In water, ribs don't need to do much. Buoyancy keeps bodies from collapsing. But on land, gravity presses harder. Tiktaalik's ribs suggest it could prop itself up, resisting collapse when it lifted its chest above the ground. This wasn't yet the posture of a true tetrapod, but it was a rehearsal. The most important evidence, though, was in its fins. Inside Tiktaalik's pectoral fins were bones that looked uncannily like the beginnings of arms. A single, sturdy bone at the base resembled a humerus. Below it were paired bones like a radius, an ulna. Even structures that looked like primitive wrist bones were present. The fin still ended in rays, not fingers, but the framework was there. Tiktaalik could use these fins to push against the bottom, to support its weight, to move in ways no ordinary fish could. They were not yet legs, but they were more than fins. What did it do with them? Most likely, Tiktaalik used its proto-limbs to maneuver in shallow water, propping itself on muddy bottoms, lifting its head to gulp air, or clambering onto sandbars and riverbanks. It was not striding across land like a lizard, but it could likely drag itself short distances, perhaps to escape predators, pursue prey, or move between drying pools. This in-between lifestyle made Tiktaalik perfectly suited for environments where water levels rose and fell, where survival depended on both swimming and pushing. Its discovery in 2004 was a milestone in paleontology. Found by Neil Shubin and his team in the Canadian Arctic, Tiktaalik filled a crucial gap in the fossil record. For years, scientists had evidence of fish like Pandorictis, with features trending toward tetrapods, and evidence of early amphibians like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, with clear limbs and digits. But the step in between was missing. Tiktaalik provided it. A fish with both gills and lungs, with fins and proto-limbs, with scales and a neck. It showed, in stone, how evolution bridges gaps not with sudden leaps but with gradual blends. Tiktaalik also reminds us that the first step onto land was not a single moment. It was a series of small steps spread across many species, many generations. Pandorictis flattened its skull and shifted its eyes. Tiktaalik added stronger ribs and proto-wrists. Later tetrapods expanded those wrists into true digits. Each piece was part of a continuum, with no single creature that could be called the first in a strict sense. Evolution doesn't draw sharp lines, it paints in gradients. Still, Tiktaalik's significance is enormous. It was an animal that could breathe air and see above water, that could push itself on proto-limbs that had a neck for lifting its head. It was an animal designed for margins, for shallow, shifting environments, and in those margins the possibility of land was born. Its world was full of challenges. On land, drying out was a constant risk. Without the protection of water, skin could desiccate, eyes could cloud, bodies could overheat. Tiktaalik likely remained close to water, never venturing far. But each time it lifted itself, each time it tested the boundary, it practiced. Those small experiments, repeated across thousands of generations, accumulated into full limbs, into lungs that could sustain, into animals that no longer needed to return to water. Tiktaalik's place in history is also a reminder of how environments shape bodies. In stable seas, fins and gills were enough. In fluctuating floodplains, they were not. The pressures of unstable habitats forced innovation. Fish that could not adapt perished. Fish like Tiktaalik found ways to endure, and in doing so, they opened doors evolution had never tried before. From such accidents of environment came the vertebrates of land. It's humbling to look at your own hand and trace its outline back to Tiktaalik. The wrist that lets you flex, the elbow that bends, the shoulder that rotates, all have their prototype in that Devonian fish. Its proto-limbs were not perfected, but they were enough to begin the story. Every tetrapod that has ever walked, hopped, crawled, flown, or sprinted carries those bones, reshaped but recognizable. In a sense, we're all still Tiktaalik, carrying its experiments in our skeletons, and Tiktaalik was not alone. Other fish of the time were testing similar paths. Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, appearing slightly later, show even clearer tetrapod traits, with limbs that bore digits, though they were still largely aquatic. Together, these creatures sketch a picture of how fins became legs, how pushing became walking, how the sea gave rise to land. Tiktaalik was one of many pioneers, but its fossil captures the transition with a clarity that few others provide. If you could sit on a Devonian riverbank, you might see Tiktaalik half submerged in a shallow pool, resting its weight on its proto-limbs, eyes scanning the air above. It might lunge at small prey near the bank, then slip back into the water with a flick of its tail. To us, it would look awkward, neither fully fish nor fully amphibian, but in its awkwardness lay innovation. Evolution often looks clumsy in the moment. Only later do we see the elegance of what it was creating, and as Tiktaalik moved in its shallow swamps, forest grew taller around it, arthropods crawled in the undergrowth, and fish of all kinds crowded the waters. It was part of a world in flux, one where every group was experimenting, adapting, pushing boundaries. Tiktaalik's steps were just one among many, but they carried forward into every land vertebrate that followed. The first steps onto land were not triumphant marches. They were slow drags across mud, cautious lifts of heads, tentative pushes of fins that were not yet legs. But they were enough to begin, enough to change the course of life forever. The Devonian world was alive with forests rising, arthropods creeping, and fish bursting into more shapes than ever before. But beneath that thriving surface, the planet itself was restless. Climate and sea levels did not hold still. Shorelines advanced and retreated, seas expanded and shrank, and ecosystems were repeatedly reshaped by the rhythms of the Earth. These shifts were not gentle background changes. They tested the resilience of life, forced adaptations, and set in motion patterns that would culminate in crises by the end of the period. To imagine the Devonian climate, you have to picture a world without polar ice caps as we know them today. For much of the early and middle Devonian, the Earth was warm, with tropical conditions stretching far across the continents. Vast shallow seas flooded continental interiors, creating marine environments rich in reefs and fish. These warm, epicontinental seas were ideal laboratories for evolution, supporting the coral kingdoms and fish diversity that made the period so famous. But such seas are fragile. They depend on sea levels remaining high, and in the Devonian, sea levels fluctuated dramatically. Sea level is tied to both climate and tectonics. Continental drift, mountain building, and shifts in ocean basins continually change the capacity of the seas. Meanwhile, atmospheric carbon dioxide influenced global temperatures, and with them, the volume of seawater. During the Devonian, as plants spread across land and forests expanded, carbon dioxide was pulled from the atmosphere in vast amounts. This reduction in greenhouse gases cooled the planet, altering rainfall and ice formation. By the late Devonian, glaciers began to form near the poles, something the Earth had not seen for a long time. As ice accumulated, sea levels dropped, exposing continental shelves and reducing the extent of shallow marine habitats. For marine life, these changes were disruptive. Coral reefs that had flourished in broad, shallow seas suddenly found themselves stranded, their environments drying or turning unstable. Fish that thrived in reef systems were forced into new habitats, competing with other species or perishing as ecosystems collapsed. The rhythm of life was tied to the rhythm of sea levels, and the rhythm was unpredictable. On land, the spread of forests intensified these shifts. Roots broke into rock, releasing minerals that washed into rivers and seas. Nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen entered marine systems in unprecedented quantities. At first, this fertilization fueled productivity, but in excess it caused imbalances. Algal blooms spread across shallow waters, consuming oxygen as they decayed, creating anoxic conditions, dead zones where marine life suffocated. Coupled with sea level changes, these oxygen crises put severe pressure on marine ecosystems. The Devonian climate was also marked by regional contrasts. Equatorial regions remained warm and humid, ideal for lush plant growth. But as forests spread and carbon dioxide fell, higher latitudes cooled. Seasonal changes grew more pronounced, and the stability of earlier tropical conditions waned. Floodplains that once received consistent rainfall faced droughts or irregular flooding. For fish in rivers and ponds, this meant water levels were less reliable, oxygen dropped more often, and the need for lungs and flexible locomotion became stronger. Environmental stress was one of the forces driving innovations like air breathing and limb-like fins. Evidence of these shifts comes from geology as much as biology. Rock layers preserve alternating marine and terrestrial sediments, telling us that seas advanced and retreated repeatedly. Black shales, rich in organic matter, mark times when oxygen in the oceans collapsed and life suffocated. Glacial deposits in late Devonian rocks reveal the growth of ice sheets, rare in earlier warm eras. Together they tell a story of a planet in flux, a climate system experimenting almost as wildly as the organisms it hosted. These changes didn't happen all at once. They unfolded over millions of years, giving some lineages time to adapt while others faltered. For reefs, however, the blows were severe. The massive reef systems built by stromatoporoids and corals during the Middle Devonian never fully recovered. They collapsed in waves, unable to withstand the combined stress of cooling, nutrient influx, and sea level change. In their place, other ecosystems rose, but the grand reef expanses of the Devonian became a memory. The land felt the climate's shifts in other ways. As forests grew denser, they altered weather patterns. Trees transpired moisture into the air, increasing rainfall in some regions. Their shade cooled the ground, creating microclimates. At the same time, their drawdown of carbon dioxide reshaped the global greenhouse. In the long term, this cooling trend helped trigger the glaciations of the late Devonian, proving that life itself was now a geological force. Plants were not just passengers on Earth's climate, they were drivers of it. For animals making their first steps onto land, these changes created both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, unstable climates meant fluctuating water levels, unpredictable droughts, and the risk of desiccation. On the other hand, those very challenges rewarded adaptations like lungs, sturdy limbs, and behaviours that allowed survival in marginal environments. Evolution is often pushed forward by instability, and the Devonian climate provided plenty of that. It's worth pausing to realise how intertwined everything had become. Plants pulled carbon dioxide from the air, cooling the planet. Cooling led to ice growth, which lowered sea levels. Lower seas reduced reef habitats, stressing fish and corals. Nutrients from plant weathering flowed into the seas, triggering oxygen crashes. These crises killed some groups but opened ecological space for others. Out of that turmoil, lobe-finned fish pushed further toward land. Every step in this chain was connected. The Devonian climate was not a backdrop. It was an actor in the story, shaping the fate of life directly. Some scientists have called the Devonian one of the first times Earth truly entered into a complex feedback loop between life and climate. Before plants spread, the atmosphere was largely shaped by geological processes. But once forest covered the land, biology gained the power to alter carbon cycles on a global scale. The late Devonian cooling, the sea level shifts, even the extinctions that followed, these were as much the result of living systems as of tectonics or volcanism. Life was remaking the planet, and not always to its own benefit. For creatures living through it, none of this would have seemed like global systems at play. A lungfish gasping in a shrinking pool didn't know forests had drawn down carbon dioxide. A reef fish struggling in oxygen. Poor water didn't know rivers had carried nutrients from tree-covered hillsides. To them, the world was simply becoming harder, less predictable. But on a planetary scale, their struggles were part of an enormous experiment between life and climate, an experiment still ongoing today. The late Devonian extinctions, which would come soon, were tied closely to these climate shifts. Multiple pulses of extinction hit marine life, wiping out reef builders, reducing fish diversity, and collapsing ecosystems. It wasn't a single cataclysm like the asteroid that ended the dinosaurs. It was a drawn-out stress test, millions of years of climate instability that some groups failed and others survived. Out of that turmoil, new ecosystems eventually emerged, but the Devonian never regained the lush reefs of its peak. And yet, the story is not only one of a loss. The instability forced innovation. Fish that could breathe air thrived when oxygen in water dropped. Fish with strong fins succeeded when shallow pools demanded crawling as much as swimming. Plants that spread seeds colonized wider areas even as climates shifted. In every crisis, some lineage found opportunity. That is the paradox of Earth's history. Change devastates, but it also creates. The Devonian climate was harsh, but it carved the path that led to amphibians stepping onto land and forests covering continents. If you could walk across a Devonian floodplain, you would see this dynamism firsthand. Rivers would shift courses with each season, sometimes swelling to vast currents, sometimes dwindling to trickles. Forests would line the banks, their roots anchoring soil, but floods would still tear channels anew. Shallow pools would steam in the sun, fish gasping at the surface. Then rains would return, filling everything again. It was a world of flux, of cycles that never fully stabilized. To live there meant to adapt constantly, to find resilience in unpredictability. Looking back, it's striking how familiar this story feels. Today we talk about climate change as a pressing issue, a force that reshapes ecosystems, shifts sea levels, and challenges survival. In the Devonian, life faced something very similar, though for different reasons. Then it was plants pulling carbon dioxide, glaciation spreading, seas rising and falling. Today, it is human industry driving the change. But the lesson is the same. Climate and life are intertwined, and when one shifts, the other must respond. The Devonian reminds us that stability is an illusion. The Earth has always been a restless planet, its climate shifting, its seas advancing and retreating, its ecosystems rising and falling. What matters is how life responds, and in the Devonian, life responded with resilience, invention, and bold steps toward the land. And as those steps grew stronger, as Tiktaalik and its kin practiced lifting themselves in shallow pools, as forests continued to thicken, the stage was set for both triumph and disaster. The climate shifts of the Devonian would test life to its limits, and not all would survive. But those that did would inherit a world reshaped, a world where vertebrates walked the land for the first time, even as reefs and marine giants faded into memory. Life in the Devonian wasn't simply about new bodies evolving, it was also about relationships. For the first time in Earth's history, ecosystems were becoming truly intricate, with predators and prey bound together in webs of interaction that stretched across oceans, rivers, lakes, and the emerging forests on land. Earlier ages had food chains, simple ladders where small creatures fed larger ones step by step. But in the Devonian, those chains multiplied into networks. Fish of every size hunted and were hunted. Plants fed grazers that in turn fed predators. Decomposers recycled waste back into soil and water, and energy coursed through systems that were now far richer than ever before. The oceans of the Devonian made this clear. Picture a shallow reef lagoon, alive with fish and invertebrates. At the base of the web were algae and tiny plankton, drifting in the currents, capturing sunlight and nutrients. They fed small invertebrates, crustaceans, early mollusks, tiny arthropods, that grazed or filtered food from the water. These in turn became prey for small fish, especially the newly evolving ray-finned fish with their agile movements. Swarms of them darted in coordinated schools, flashing silver in the light, a feast for any predator fast enough to break their unity. Among the hunters were placoderms, their armoured jaws capable of shearing through flesh and shell. Some specialised in crushing hard prey, feasting on armoured invertebrates or shelled animals. Others grew massive like Dunkleosteus, apex predators that could bite through anything in their path, even other armoured fish. Around them prowled early sharks, faster and more agile, using speed and sensory awareness to hunt in ways armour-plated giants could not. It was not a simple hierarchy, but a shifting battlefield of strategies. An armoured fish could resist some predators but not others. A fast swimmer could evade placoderms but fall victim to ambush hunters lurking in shallows. For every adaptation there was a counter. Lobe-finned fish added another dimension. Some lurked near the bottom, their fleshy fins allowing them to brace and lunge at prey. Others moved into shallower waters where lungs gave them an advantage in oxygen-poor habitats. Their size and power made them formidable hunters in their own right, but they were also prey for larger placoderms or sharks. The Devonian seas were filled with these interactions, predators and prey locked in evolutionary arms races, each driving the other toward new innovations. On reefs, the complexity deepened. Coral and stromatoporoid structures created habitats with countless niches. Small fish wove through crevices, hiding from larger hunters. Invertebrates grazed on algae that grew in sunlit shallows. Predators stalked these clusters of life, and scavengers followed in their wake, consuming leftovers. The reef was not just a collection of species, it was a living city, each resident tied to others in ways that made the whole system resilient yet sensitive to disruption. Freshwater systems added another layer. Rivers and lakes, newly stabilised by plants along their banks, supported communities of fish and invertebrates that interacted in their own webs. Here, air-breathing fish like lungfish gained an advantage, able to survive in stagnant pools when others suffocated. Detritivores fed on organic matter washed in from forests, creating links between terrestrial and aquatic systems. For the first time, land and water were tightly bound in food webs, with nutrients flowing both ways. Forest litter entered streams, feeding aquatic decomposers, while insects and arthropods on land sometimes became prey for fish lurking near the water's edge. On land, the first food webs were simpler but no less important. Plants formed the base, from mossy mats to towering Archaeopteris trees. arthropods fed on decaying material, breaking it down into soils. Millipedes grazed on detritus, while centipedes hunted smaller arthropods. Scorpions lurked among roots, stingers ready. Insects crawled over stems, feeding in different ways. It was not yet the bustling diversity of later terrestrial ecosystems, but it was a beginning. Predators and prey were establishing the first terrestrial balances, with decomposers ensuring that energy cycled back into the system. What made Devonian food webs especially complex was the overlap between worlds. An arthropod might scuttle on land but fall into a stream and become food for fish. A fish might die in shallow water, its carcass washed ashore to feed decomposers. Nutrients cycled between ecosystems in ways that bound them together, making the Devonian Earth more interconnected than ever before. Life was no longer confined to narrow habitats. It was spreading across boundaries, and the web of interactions was tightening. The rise of large predators amplified these dynamics. Dunkleosteus, with its massive bite, likely shaped the behaviour of entire ecosystems. Smaller fish had to evolve better defences, speed, schooling behaviour or armour to survive. Sharks refined their bodies for pursuit, becoming faster, leaner, more efficient hunters. Even invertebrates responded, with shells thickening or behaviours shifting to avoid predation. Every predator exerted pressure downward in the web, and every prey response reshaped the predator in turn. This constant back and forth was the engine of Devonian innovation. One remarkable result of this complexity was stability, up to a point. A diverse food web can withstand the loss of one link, because others can fill the gap. But it also means that disruptions ripple widely. When reefs collapsed, it wasn't only corals that vanished. The entire network of species that depended on them fell apart, from algae to predators. When oxygen dropped in shallow seas, it didn't just kill plankton, it starved the fish that fed on them and the predators that fed on those fish. Complexity is a double-edged sword, creating both resilience and vulnerability. It's striking to realise that this was the first time Earth had such layered ecosystems. Before, life was simpler, with fewer species and fewer connections. The Devonian was the turning point, when food webs became webs in the true sense, not just chains. The interactions we take for granted today, predators keeping prey populations in check, scavengers recycling nutrients, decomposers maintaining soil fertility, all found their origins here. For us, the significance is enormous. We live in a world of complex food webs that sustain biodiversity, agriculture, and the very air we breathe. Those webs trace back to the Devonian, when fish, plants, and arthropods together built the first intricate systems. The balance of predator and prey that shapes our own ecosystems has its roots in those ancient seas and forests. If you could drift through a Devonian reef, you would see the web in action. Plankton drifting unseen, small fish darting, larger predators lurking, scavengers cleaning the remains, decomposers recycling everything back to the base. On land, you'd see millipedes munching on fallen fronds, centipedes striking at unsuspecting prey, scorpions waiting in shadows. Every movement was linked, every creature part of a greater whole. It wasn't just survival of individuals, it was survival of systems that were beginning to resemble the complexity of our modern Earth. And as these food webs grew richer, they set the stage for the future. When vertebrates finally established themselves on land, they would enter ecosystems already primed with interactions. They would find food waiting, niches open, and predators already in place. The Devonian food webs were not just products of their time, they were blueprints for the ages to come. The Devonian had been an age of thriving seas and greening continents, of fish diversifying into every imaginable form, and plants transforming the land into forests. But toward its end, the same dynamism that made it so vibrant turned against it. The balance tipped. Ecosystems that had flourished for millions of years began to unravel. Reefs collapsed, Oxygen levels dropped, seas withdrew, climates cooled, and species that had defined the age disappeared. This was one of Earth's great mass extinctions, the late Devonian crisis, and though it unfolded over millions of years in multiple pulses, its impact was as deep as any sudden cataclysm. The collapse began in the oceans, where reefs had been the centres of life. For much of the Devonian, corals and stromatoporoids had built massive reef systems stretching for hundreds of kilometres, some of the largest reefs in Earth's history. They were cradles of biodiversity, supporting fish, invertebrates, algae, and countless interactions. But reefs are fragile. They depend on clear, stable, nutrient-balanced waters. By the late Devonian, that balance was gone. Forests on land had begun releasing vast amounts of nutrients into rivers. Roots broke down rock, rains washed minerals into streams, and those streams carried phosphorus and nitrogen into coastal waters. At first, this fertilization fueled productivity, but too much of it triggered algal blooms. Algae spread across shallow seas, and when they died, decomposition consumed oxygen. Whole regions of ocean became anoxic, dead zones where little could survive. Reefs suffocated, their builders overwhelmed by conditions they could not tolerate. The first blow of the extinction was struck when these vast reef systems collapsed, never to rise again in the same way. It wasn't only the reefs. Fish diversity began to suffer. Placoderms, the armoured giants that had ruled the seas, dwindled. Their dominance, once unchallenged, faded as ecosystems destabilised. Some groups of sharks and lobe-finned fish endured, but many lineages vanished. The once crowded Devonian seas grew emptier, their food webs unravelling. Apex predators lost prey, mid-level species lost their habitats, and the cascading effects spread through the entire marine system. The timing of these crises wasn't uniform. Scientists identify at least two major pulses of extinction near the end of the Devonian, separated by millions of years. The first, around 375 million years ago, devastated reef ecosystems. The second, around 360 million years ago, known as the Hangenberg event, struck even more widely, affecting both marine and terrestrial life. This wasn't a single hammer blow like the asteroid that ended the dinosaurs. It was more like a drawn-out siege, with multiple assaults wearing ecosystems down. Climate shifts played a central role. As forests pulled carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, greenhouse warming diminished. Global cooling set in, and evidence points to the spread of glaciers in what are now South America and Africa. As ice sheets grew, sea levels dropped, exposing continental shelves and shrinking shallow seas. These shallow waters had been hotspots of biodiversity, but now they vanished, taking habitats with them. The combination of cooling, habitat loss and anoxia proved devastating. Species adapted to warm, stable seas could not cope with fluctuating conditions. Geology records these moments in striking ways. Black shale deposits mark times of widespread anoxia, layers rich in organic matter left behind when oxygen collapsed. Glacial deposits in late Devonian strata show ice advancing. Shifts in sediment types reflect changing sea levels, marine layers giving way to terrestrial deposits, and back again as seas rose and fell. In every line of evidence we see the fingerprints of instability. On land, the extinctions were less dramatic but still significant. Forests themselves survived, but the animals living among them faced challenges. Arthropods that depended on certain habitats suffered as climates shifted. Early tetrapods, just beginning to explore land, found their marginal worlds of ponds and floodplains disappearing or becoming unpredictable. It was not a wholesale wipeout on land the way it was in the seas, but it was enough to slow the pace of colonization, to test the resilience of pioneers who had only just begun their experiments in breathing air and walking on limbs. For marine life, the devastation was long-lasting. Reef ecosystems, once the grand stage of Devonian seas, never recovered to their former scale. It would be tens of millions of years before reefs re-emerged in anything like their old abundance, and even then, They were built by different organisms. Placoderms, once dominant, disappeared entirely, victims of the changing seas, and perhaps competition with sharks and ray fins that proved more adaptable. Trilobites, though they had survived since the Cambrian, suffered heavily as well, losing many lineages. Whole families of brachiopods, corals and ammonoids vanished. The oceans were left emptier, less intricate, less diverse. Why did this extinction happen in multiple waves? The answer likely lies in the feedback loops between life and environment. As forests expanded, they drew down carbon dioxide, cooling the planet and destabilizing climate. Cooling and glaciation lowered sea levels, disrupting marine habitats. Nutrient runoff created anoxic events, killing reefs. Each disruption weakened ecosystems, making them more vulnerable to the next. By the time the final pulse struck, life had already been battered by earlier crises. The cumulative effect was catastrophic, and yet, even in loss, there were survivors. Sharks endured, their streamlined bodies and adaptable hunting styles serving them well. Ray-finned fish, still modest in their Devonian forms, survived and would later explode into dominance in the Carboniferous and beyond. Lobe-fins persisted too, with some lineages carrying the tetrapod story forward onto land. Forests survived, though they changed global cycles in ways that had triggered the crises. Life was diminished, but it was not destroyed. As always in Earth's history, extinction pruned the tree of life, but the branches that remained grew anew. The late Devonian extinction was not the most famous of Earth's mass extinctions, overshadowed by the Permian or the Cretaceous, but its effects were profound. It marked the end of the Great Devonian Reefs, the decline of placoderms, and the reshaping of marine ecosystems. It tested the resilience of early terrestrial life, slowing but not stopping the colonization of land. It demonstrated how tightly life and climate were intertwined, how plants could alter the atmosphere, how oceans could turn against their inhabitants. If you could drift above a reef before the collapse, you would see fish darting, corals building, predators prowling, a thriving community. Drift again a few million years later, and you would see emptiness, corals gone, fish scarce, the waters murky and low in oxygen. The transformation was not sudden to the creatures living it. It came over generations, each one facing slightly harsher conditions than the last. But in the long arc of history, it was a crash. For us, the lesson is clear. Life is resilient, but it is also vulnerable to shifts in climate, sea level and chemistry. The Devonian extinction was not caused by a cosmic impact or a singular volcanic outburst, but by slower changes amplified through feedback loops. It shows how small shifts, compounded over time, can unravel even the richest ecosystems. And yet from that unravelling came opportunity. With placoderms gone, sharks rose. With reefs collapsed, new marine systems formed. With some lobe fins surviving, tetrapods continued their tentative steps onto land. The extinction was a pruning, harsh and far-reaching, but it did not erase the story. It redirected it. As the Devonian ended, the Earth was a quieter place than it had been at its peak. The seas were less crowded, the reefs diminished, the food web simplified. But the continent still carried forests, the rivers still flowed, the first amphibians still crept through shallows. The age of fishes had ended in crisis, but its legacy carried forward in every vertebrate that walked the land afterward. When the dust of the Devonian extinction settled, the world was not empty. It was scarred, quieter, and simpler than before, but life remained. Some of the giants were gone forever, the armoured placoderms, the grand reef builders, many trilobite lineages, but other groups endured, sometimes diminished, sometimes waiting to rise again. Survival in such times is rarely a matter of strength alone. It depends on flexibility, on chance, on the right traits at the right moment. The creatures that carried the story forward into the Carboniferous were not always the obvious champions. They were those able to adapt to a world remade. One of the most important survivors was the lineage of sharks. While placoderms vanished, sharks endured, continuing to refine their bodies into sleeker, faster, more efficient predators. Early sharks like Tilak had already demonstrated the advantages of cartilage over bone, lightness, speed, agility. In the unstable seas after the extinction, these traits served them well. Without placoderms to compete with, sharks expanded into new roles. Over the next tens of millions of years, they would diversify further, eventually becoming the enduring predators we still see today. Their survival was not just endurance, it was a transfer of dominance, from armoured jaws to streamlined hunters. Ray-finned fish also persisted, though in the Devonian they had not yet reached their full potential. They were small, relatively modest compared to placoderms and lobe-fins, but their delicate fins, supported by bony rays, gave them unmatched agility. They could dart, turn, hover in ways other fish could not. These skills, combined with rapid reproductive cycles, made them resilient in changing environments. In the wake of the extinction, ray fins filled vacant niches, and across the Carboniferous they began their rise toward dominance. Today, they make up the vast majority of fish species on Earth. Their survival in the Devonian was quiet but decisive. The lobe-finned fish too endured, though many of their lineages dwindled. The great coelacanths retreated to deeper waters, surviving as relics even into modern times. Lungfish, with their dual capacity for air and water breathing, weathered the crises by retreating into burrows and enduring droughts that killed others. Their ability to survive poor conditions gave them an edge when oxygen levels fell or habitats collapsed. But perhaps the most significant lobe fins were those that stepped further toward land. Early tetrapods like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega emerged in the late Devonian and carried forward into the Carboniferous, proving that the transition to limbs and air-breathing vertebrates was not just an experiment but a permanent foothold. Even extinction could not erase that step. Among invertebrates, some groups fared better than others. The great stromatoporoid reefs collapsed, and many coral lineages vanished, but brachiopods, mollusks and ammonoids managed to persist, adapting to new environments. Trilobites, though diminished, clung on in reduced numbers, their diversity cut but not erased. Ammonoids in particular would later thrive in the open seas of the Carboniferous and Permian, becoming some of the most successful invertebrate groups of their time. Survival often favours those who can shift habitats or feeding strategies, and these groups did just that. On land, plants were among the most resilient survivors. Forests did not collapse during the extinctions. Archaeopteris and other early trees continued to dominate landscapes, their roots anchoring soils, their canopies shaping climates. The very forests that had triggered climate changes by pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere were themselves robust against the extinctions they helped cause. They continued to spread across continents, expanding their hold on terrestrial ecosystems. Their survival meant that the oxygen-rich atmosphere they had begun creating persisted, paving the way for even larger and more active land animals in the future. Arthropods on land also weathered the storm. Millipedes, scorpions and early insects persisted in the undergrowth, recycling detritus and preying on one another. Their small size, generalist diets and ability to exploit microhabitats gave them resilience. They did not depend on vast fragile ecosystems the way reefs did. Instead, they lived in the litter, the soil, the cracks of bark and stone. In times of collapse, such lifestyles are insurance. The underworld of decomposers and small predators endured while grander systems fell. It's striking how often survival in mass extinctions favours flexibility over grandeur. Placoderms, with their massive armour and specialised jaws, could dominate stable ecosystems but proved fragile when conditions shifted. Sharks, nimble and adaptable, endured. Stromatoporoids built vast reefs but collapsed when waters soured, while smaller, more flexible invertebrates carried on. The lesson repeats across time. Survival is not about being the strongest, but about being able to bend with change. The legacies of the Devonian survivors were immense. By enduring, they shaped the Carboniferous world that followed. Sharks rose to new prominence as apex predators. Ray-finned fish exploded into diversity, filling oceans, rivers and lakes. Lobe-fins carried vertebrates onto land, beginning the great story of tetrapods. Forests continued their march, stabilizing landscapes and fueling the cycles of oxygen and carbon. Arthropods expanded, and insects soon developed wings, transforming terrestrial ecosystems. Even the extinctions themselves left legacies. By removing dominant groups like placoderms and stromatoporoids, they cleared ecological space for others to rise. Sharks might never have gained their dominance if placoderms had endured. Ray fins might not have flourished so completely without competitors. The extinction reset the stage, and in the aftermath, survivors rewrote the script of evolution. The world that emerged was different. The great reefs of the Devonian never returned. Marine ecosystems became simpler in structure, though still rich in species. On land, forests expanded further, shaping climates and soils even more deeply. The survivors were not just remnants of a lost age, they were architects of the one to come. It's worth imagining how quiet the seas might have felt after the collapse. Where once reefs bustled with life, there were barren expanses. Where once armoured giants ruled, there were sleeker hunters. The noise of diversity had lessened, but the seeds of future worlds remained. Sharks gliding in open waters, ray fins darting in schools, lungfish burrowed in mud, amphibians pushing through ferns. All were survivors, carrying with them the resilience of their ancestors. For us, these survivors matter deeply. Every vertebrate on land today traces its ancestry to lobe fins that endured the Devonian extinctions. Every coral reef today is built by descendants of survivors who carried on after stromatoporoids fell. Every forest today is an echo of those that weathered the crisis. Survival is not just about endurance in the moment, it is about legacy across eons. The Devonian extinctions remind us that life is fragile but also persistent. Entire worlds can collapse, but some lineages endure, carrying forward traits that will define the future. In those survivors, we see both the vulnerability and the resilience of life. They are proof that even in the darkest times the story never ends, it changes direction. If you could walk through a late Devonian forest after the extinctions had passed, you might not notice the absence of placoderms or reefs. The trees would still tower, the air would still be rich with oxygen, arthropods would still creep underfoot. But if you looked into rivers and seas, you would sense the difference. Fewer giants, simpler ecosystems, but survivors continuing on. Those survivors, humble or sleek, quiet or persistent, were the bridge into the next age. And as the Carboniferous dawned, they would seize the opportunities left open, diversifying, expanding, reshaping the Earth once more. The Devonian had ended, but its survivors ensured that life's story continued, carrying the legacies of resilience and adaptation that still shape us today. When we talk about the Devonian, it can feel impossibly distant. A time of armoured fish and forests that look nothing like ours, an alien world separated by almost 400 million years. But the truth is, we carry the Devonian with us every day. It is in our bones, in our lungs, in our eyes, in the very code of our DNA. The strange creatures of that age are not just fossils in museums or illustrations in books. They are ancestors whose experiments live on inside us. Every step we take is shaped by fins that learn to push against the mud. Every breath we draw is a gift from fish that discovered lungs. Every glance at a horizon is possible because eyes once shifted to see above the waterline. The Devonian is not gone. It is written in us. Start with our skeletons. The basic plan of our arms and legs, one long bone followed by two paired bones, then a cluster of smaller bones, then digits, was first sketched inside the fins of lobe-finned fish. Creatures like Eusthenopteron and Tiktaalik carried those structures, not as arms, not yet, but as proto-limbs that allowed them to push and prop. The humerus, the radius, the ulna, the wrist. All of them were born in fins. When you lift your hand, when you bend your elbow, when you grasp an object, you are reenacting a design laid down in the Devonian. The very framework of our motion is their gift. Our lungs tell the same story. In Devonian waters where oxygen ran low, some fish evolved sacs branching off from their digestive tracts, primitive lungs that allowed them to gulp air. Lungfish used them to survive droughts. Lobe-fins used them to linger in shallow, stagnant pools. Those lungs were passed on, refined, and carried into tetrapods. Today, every vertebrate on land breathes because of that invention. The rhythm of inhale and exhale that keeps us alive began as a desperate gulp at the surface of a Devonian pond. Even our sense of sight is tied to that age. The placement of eyes on flat-headed fish like Panderichthys and Tiktaalik, gazing upward into air, was the first step toward terrestrial vision. Their larger sockets, their upward-facing gaze, their gradual adaptation to light in air, all were precursors to the eyes we use to read, to watch the sky, to see each other's faces. When we look above water, when we track motion across open air, we're using eyes that were trained first by Devonian fish. The story is deeper still, carried in our DNA. Genetic studies show that many of the developmental programs that build our limbs, lungs, and sensory organs were already present in fish. Genes like HOX, which guide the patterning of limbs, were at work in lobe-fins long before the first tetrapod crawled on land. The switches that turned fins into arms, that shaped digits, that refined lungs and eyes, all of them were written in the genomes of Devonian ancestors. We carry those genes still, ancient scripts that once built fins now building fingers. Evolution didn't invent new instructions from scratch when vertebrates came onto land. It rewrote old ones, repurposed existing codes. The Devonian lives in those codes, silent but essential. Our blood carries echoes too. Hemoglobin, the protein that transports oxygen in our bodies, evolved long before the Devonian, but its refinement in air-breathing vertebrates owes much to those fish that balance between gills and lungs. Their circulatory systems had to adapt to shifting oxygen sources to manage the transition between water and air. The dual circulation of modern tetrapods, one loop for lungs, one for the rest of the body, can be traced back to those early experiments. Every beat of our hearts, every rush of oxygen through our blood, is part of a system that Devonian fish pioneered. And then there is the brain. When lobe fins began peering above water, their nervous systems adapted to new sensory inputs. Air carried sound differently than water, light refracted differently, smells travelled differently. Their brains had to integrate these new signals to make sense of a world that was suddenly broader and more complex. Those adaptations laid foundations for the sensory worlds of amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and us. When we listen, when we smell, when we see and coordinate, we are living in the expanded sensory realm that Devonian pioneers first tested. Our DNA also holds traces of their resilience. The very fact that lobe fins, lungfish, and early tetrapods survived the Devonian extinctions means their lineages carried traits that could endure instability. Flexibility, dual breathing, sturdy limbs, all of these made survival possible in a world where reefs crumbled and seas suffocated. By surviving, they ensured that their genetic legacy would persist, that it would flow forward into every vertebrate to come. Without their endurance, there would be no amphibians, no reptiles, no mammals, no humans. Even beyond vertebrates, we carry the Devonian in the ecosystems that support us. The forests that first spread in that era created soils, stabilized rivers, and filled the atmosphere with oxygen. The balance they struck, the cycles they set in motion, continue to this day. Every forest we walk through, every breath we take in an oxygen-rich world, is a continuation of what Devonian plants began. Their DNA, too, carries forward, shaping the green world around us. it's easy to forget how much of our story is shared with fish. We think of them as separate, distant, but the truth is every human body is a modified fish body, reshaped by time but still recognisable. Our jaws are the descendants of gill arches. Our inner ears carry bones that once supported gills. Our limbs are fins transformed. Even our embryos echo this history, with gill-like structures appearing briefly as reminders of our ancestry. We are not just descended from fish. We are fish, evolved and altered, but still carrying their blueprint. Think of it this way. When you walk, you are a fish learning to push fins against mud. When you breathe, you are a fish gulping air in a stagnant pool. When you see across a landscape, you're a fish peering above the waterline. These are not metaphors. They are literal continuities, written in bones and blood and genes. The Devonian is not just a chapter in Earth's history, it is a living part of us. Even the failures of that age shaped us. Placoderms are gone, but their jaws paved the way for ours. The great reefs are gone, but their collapse opened space for lineages that survived. The extinctions pruned the tree of life, leaving branches that would grow into us. The Devonian is filled with ghosts, but we carry those ghosts within us, not as burdens, but as structures, systems, capacities. If you look at your hand and flex your fingers, you are seeing Devonian heritage in motion. If you take a deep breath, you are living in their invention. If you look at the horizon, you are using eyes that first turned upward in that age. If you read words on a page or screen, you are using neural systems shaped by sensory expansions that began when fish first tested the air. Every part of you is an echo of that ancient time. And so, when we study the Devonian, we're not just studying fossils or distant events, we're studying ourselves. Our DNA is a history book, and the Devonian chapters are written in every cell. They tell of forests rising, fish diversifying, lungs forming, eyes shifting, limbs emerging. They tell of extinctions endured and adaptations carried forward. They tell of the first vertebrates daring to step onto land, a step that would lead, countless generations later, to us. The Devonian is long behind us in years, yet close in our bones, our breath, and our gaze. It is easy to treat it as a distant curiosity, an age of armoured fish and primitive forests that has little to do with our modern lives. But if you sit quietly and think about what it represents, the distance collapses. Time is not a series of disconnected eras. It is a river, and the Devonian is one of its great bends. The water that carried lobe-finned fish onto muddy shores is the same current that carries us now. We're downstream, but we're not separate. When we talk about evolution, it can feel abstract, a concept in textbooks, a word too large to touch. But the Devonian shows us what it really means. It is not a ladder climbing toward progress. It is not a story with predetermined heroes. It is improvisation, trial and error, countless small adjustments made in response to shifting worlds. Fish did not grow lungs because the future demanded humans. They grew lungs because the water was shallow and oxygen poor, because survival required it in that moment. Fins did not become limbs because the earth needed mammals one day. They became limbs because mud was soft, because pools dried, because pushing forward meant living a little longer. Evolution is not foresight. It is response. Yet in those responses, the possibilities of the future were hidden. Think of how fragile it all was. Tiktaalik lifting itself on proto-limbs, lungs gulping in air, eyes peering above the waterline. None of this was guaranteed. It was chance stacked on chance, opportunity seized in a world that punished hesitation. If the climate had shifted differently, if extinctions had swept away other lineages, if survival had chosen another path, we might not be here. Yet the line held. The Devonian gave us forests that reshaped the atmosphere, reefs that built early ecosystems, extinctions that pruned but did not erase, survivors that carried the story forward. It was a time of abundance and of collapse, and out of both came the seeds of all that followed. The rhythm of extinction and survival in the Devonian echoes loudly today. Reefs crumbled under stress then, just as reefs crumble under stress now. Oxygen in oceans collapsed then, just as dead zones spread in our seas today. Carbon cycles shifted then under the force of forests, just as they shift now under the force of industry. The Devonian reminds us that life is resilient, but also vulnerable, that ecosystems can flourish for millions of years and then unravel in a geological instant. The difference is that now the driver of change is us, and yet that realization does not need to feel only heavy. It can also feel connective. To live in the present is to stand in the current of billions of years, to be shaped by ages we will never see, but whose fingerprints are on us. The Devonian's forests breathe in our lungs, its fish flex in our joints, its experiments live in our genomes. To understand that is to feel less alone in time, to recognise that we are not separate from Earth's history but expressions of it. Consider what time means here. 400 million years is impossible to feel directly. We measure it in rocks, in isotopes, in the spacing of fossils, but within us those years collapse. Our hands are Devonian, our breathing is Devonian, our sight is Devonian. In this way, time is not an endless distance, but a continuity, a layering of the past inside the present. Every day we live is also a day in which Devonian innovations function silently, keeping us alive. That age is not gone, it flows within us. There is also humility in this story. The armoured placoderms that once ruled the seas are gone. The stromatoporoid reefs are gone. The trilobites that survived for so long dwindled, and even the forests of Archaeopteryx eventually gave way to others. Dominance does not last. No lineage holds the world forever. That includes us. Our species is only a blink in time, less than a second on the scale of the Devonian. To imagine that we are separate or permanent is to forget how time works. The Devonian teaches us that the Earth is patient and that all life is temporary. And yet, there is beauty in that impermanence. Each age contributes, leaves its mark and passes the current forward. The Devonian passed us lungs, limbs, forests, ecosystems of complexity. We inherited them, reshaped them, and now we stand as part of that flow. One day, we too will pass things forward, whether through our genes, our fossils, or the changes we make to the Earth. Time is not about permanence, it is about connection. If you stand beside a river and watch its water slide past, you're seeing evolution in motion. The drops that touch your hand are not the same ones that moved a kilometre upstream. They will not be the same that flow downstream tomorrow. Yet the river is continuous. So it is with time. The Devonian was upstream, its drops long gone, but the current it set in motion flows into us. When fish first pushed themselves into the shallows, the river bent. When forests pulled carbon from the air, the river shifted course. When reefs collapsed, the river stumbled, then flowed on. And now, here we are standing in the same current, carried forward by choices made by lives long vanished. In the Devonian, fish learn to breathe air. In us, that breath becomes words, stories, songs. In the Devonian, eyes turned upward. In us, they see stars, galaxies, the cosmos. In the Devonian, fins pressed against mud. In us, those limbs build cities, explore planets, write histories. None of this was destined, but all of it is connected. That is why the Devonian still matters. Not because we can recite its dates or its fossils, but because we live in its wake. To know its story is to know our own. To feel its weight is to feel the continuity of life across unfathomable spans of time. We are not separate from those fish, those forests, those reefs. We are them, carried forward, altered but recognisable. The Devonian is not gone. It is alive in every heartbeat, every breath, every glance at the world around us. So as we close this journey, Think of the current you stand in. Think of the time that flows through you, the evolution written in your cells, the Devonian whispers in your DNA. Think of how fragile, how miraculous, how interconnected it all is. And remember that we are not the end of the story, only the latest part of the river. The current moves on, the Devonian flows within us, and through us it flows forward still.